Welcome back to the Stoic Handbook podcast, Donald. This is, I think it's got to be maybe the fourth interview that I've done with you. So,
well, it's a pleasure. I like doing this podcast as well. I like speaking to your audience, and it's good to speak to you again. It's nice to be here.
Last time we spoke, we talked about Verissimus, the graphic novel, and you mentioned that you were working on a Marcus Aurelius biography, which has also come out. And this conversation we're going to be having is going to focus primarily on Socrates, and you've got a book coming out on the 19th of November, correct? Called How to Think Like Socrates.
Yeah, I wrote 3 books in a row about Marcus Aurelius, and then I thought I should write a book about someone else for a change, you know? So I wanted to write about Socrates. Socrates is my favourite philosopher.
Well, I actually took your course on Socrates, so you have a lot of information in that course. It's very, very dense. Keep going back over it and over it. There's a lot to learn. I was excited to see that you were going to do a book dedicated to this.
Well, the challenge was, I was saying earlier that I think people asked me about this before, actually, and I said I didn't think it was possible to write a book like this about Socrates. I was kind of toying with the idea, though, and I think somewhere along the line I must have convinced myself it was possible somehow. And now I've done it, and it's coming out. But I wasn't sure, because Socrates is a more complex, multifaceted, ambiguous character than Marcus Aurelius, both in terms of his personality and the historical sources and the type of philosophy that he's doing. It's not as cut. The Stoics like slogans and maxims, and Socrates has his share of those. But he prefers questions, and he's often implying ideas or skirting around them, you know. So he's a little bit harder to pin down. I can't say enough, and I'll try and only use this word once or twice, but everything about Socrates is paradoxical, which is pretty typically Greek as well. And it's like peeling the layers off an onion when you study Socrates. So I love Marcus Aurelius. No offense to Marcus Aurelius, but Socrates is a much more nuanced, multifaceted type of character to write about. And I really enjoyed writing about him. And the other thing, just to make life even worse, like for an author trying to write about him, is that we have this image, I think, of Socrates as a guy in sandals, hanging around in a pleasant grove, talking to his buddies, in a somewhat abstract way. Plato does mention famous historical figures. He alludes to historical events, but nevertheless, I think still people come away from reading Plato's and Xenophon's dialogues with this kind of feeling that Socrates is a little bit detached from the historical events around him. We often get that feeling with philosophers, but in fact, Socrates lived through the plague of Athens, the Peloponnesian War, which is one of the most epic conflicts in European history, went on for 27 years. He fought in it in at least 3 major battles. He knew and rubbed shoulders with some of the leading politicians and greatest minds of his era. He lived through a dictatorship in the fall of the Athenian democracy. I think they tried to kill him or execute him maybe 3 or 4 times altogether. So he actually had a really dramatic, colourful life. And I think also, you know, the very nature of the dialogues is they mention these people that he's talking to. But often when people are reading them at university and so on, they don't know that much about the people he's talking to. But Socrates was surrounded by this kind of ensemble of characters that are incredibly colourful, vibrant people. I guess it's a writer's dream come true in a way. It's very cinematic. And so that's how I approached the book. I approached it kind of like I was writing a screenplay for a movie or something like that.
Love that, yeah, because it was there's periods where you set the scene of I'm picturing myself there and the little details of the scene, and then you let some of the dialogues just go on, so you can really get like a sense of the dialogues in context instead of it being this kind of hard to read. I can't quite picture what's going on there. I did appreciate that. It was really a nice way to read the dialogues, the way that I could picture what was happening.
I think something that helps a little bit as well, for me anyway, is that often the interlocutors, which is what we call the people that someone is talking to in a dialogue, his buddies, they're not always his buddies, but the people he's talking to, sometimes they're pretty argumentative and actually at times quite rude to Socrates. And so I tried to add, beyond what you tend to get in Plato and Xenophon, I added a few references to body language and the tone of voice and things to kind of make it come alive. I think it's more interesting when people are talking in quite a heated way about philosophical debates, about politics and rhetoric and the meaning of life and the nature of justice, and sometimes it's getting, it's getting quite confrontational.
Definitely. Those are the videos that go viral, the debates that get heated. And yeah. One of the things I would like you to do for the listeners is, if you don't mind, is to try and bring Socrates to life and to try and explain some of his day. Because a lot of people who don't know him that well is a detached, wise statue figure in their mind. But I'm curious, how did he live his day-to-day life, and what did he wear, and what did he eat, and all of those things about him as a human.
Yeah, his day-to-day life. Actually, funnily enough, Xenophon tells us. So Xenophon is one of his students, who happens also to be a famous Athenian general. So Socrates was a weird-looking guy. The Greeks called him atopos, describe him as being atopos, which literally means out of place, like he was a misfit. So on the one hand, he's a misfit. On the other hand, he's the quintessential Athenian philosopher. He kind of, almost in a way, kind of embodies the city of Athens in a sense, while at the same time seeming like a real misfit in that city. And his friends say he had eyes like a crab. He had a face like a torpedo fish. He walked like a pelican. And, they describe him like a satyr, like one of these like goat-like creatures like Pan. And those are his friends, right? He was balding and pot-bellied. And the reason all that stuff's interesting is he grew up in a period where the human form, and particularly the male form, was idealized. And so, the Greek art is obsessed with male physical perfection, like the athletic physique and stuff like that. So Socrates was this kind of seen by some people as a kind of misshapen, almost they would have seen him as, and I'm deadly serious about this, I think it's quite an important point about him. In Greek theatre, there's a kind of stock formula in the satirical plays where there's a kind of pretentious character, usually someone who's more upper middle class or noble. And then there's a kind of buffoon, like a country bumpkin or whatever, that is a sort of everyman and punctures their conceit by, asking them stupid questions and so on. And these are stock characters in Greek theatre. People would have definitely seen Socrates, both in his physical appearance and in his behaviour, as resembling a buffoon in Greek satirical theatre, I believe. And so he was an odd, kind of strange guy. He was both really attractive to people and kind of repellent to them at the same time. In the morning, if I remember rightly, he went to the gymnasia, according to Xenophon. So Athens had 3 major gymnasia. And a gymnasium in ancient Athens is kind of, I guess the best way to describe it would be it's a bit like what we would call recreational, like a sports ground, where there's running tracks, a big park where people are doing pankration, or it would be like mixed martial arts and boxing and wrestling, running, maybe throwing javelin. But there's also libraries and shrines and people doing public speaking. They're kind of like on a soapbox or giving lectures. So there would be young men training for their military career and also doing dance. Like they had this military athletic dance that they would do. So performing, kind of doing ritualistic dance and exercise and so on. And then there'd be older men talking about philosophy and politics and giving speeches. Basically, while they wander through the walkways and the parks, that's where Socrates would spend his mornings. So often surrounded by intellectuals, but also a lot of adolescent boys doing boxing and stuff, and very outdoors. like walking around doing philosophy. The gymnasia of Athens were the Lyceum, the Academy, which became famous later as the schools of Aristotle, the location of the famous school of Aristotle and the school of Plato, and also Konosarges, which is associated with the Cynic school of philosophy to some extent, where poorer citizens would go and train. So that's what he did in the morning. And then, if I remember rightly, in the afternoon, he would go to the Agora. So Socrates was also very well known for hanging around in the city centre of Athens, which would be a little bit like hanging around in a shopping mall today. So that's where all the market stalls were. There were shops and loads of public buildings as well. The Stoa Poikile, the home of Stoicism, it's like a colonnade, was there. It's beneath the Acropolis and kind of in the shadow of the Acropolis and the Parthenon Temple. And ironically, as far as we know, the court where he was placed on trial and the prison where he was kept pending his execution were both located in the Agora, where he would typically hang out every afternoon of his life. So he would have been hanging around just outside the walls of the prison. And then later he would be on the other side of them, probably hearing the same voices that he heard every day, but this time on the other side of the wall, on the outside of the wall. And he hung around in shopkeepers. So I'll tell you a little bit of trivia about Socrates. It's kind of gold dust to historians when we have these textual sources that often are surprisingly questionable from the ancient world. So we get little anecdotes. We get people's enemies criticizing them. We get jokes about people and satirical plays about them. And so sometimes it's difficult to know how much of this stuff we can take literally by the very nature of it. So there's an anecdote that Socrates was friends with a shoemaker called Simon. And he would hang out in Simon's shoe shop and talk about philosophy. And Simon wrote down everything he said. And he was the first person, allegedly, to publish Socratic dialogues after Socrates died. So there were many different followers of Socrates that published Socratic dialogues, but today it's mainly the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon that survive, like almost all, apart from some fragments, the rest of them are all lost. But supposedly Simon the Shoemaker was the first person to write these dialogues. And historians thought this is ironic. It's got to be satirical, because Socrates is famous for going barefoot everywhere. So the idea that he sat in a shoemaker's shop all afternoon doing philosophy, and this guy's like, Socrates, when are you ever going to buy a pair of shoes? Like, none of your friends wear shoes either. Like, is he ever going to put me out of business? Seems like it's like a joke or something, right? However, when the Greek government were digging up the archaeological remains of the Agora, they found lots of shops and the ruins of them. And they found the ruins of a shop where there were nails that they believe are used for making shoes. And they also found something that's pretty common in archaeology in Greece. A Greek terracotta wine cup is called a kylix. And at the base of it, people would scratch their name, so because it belonged to you, right? It's got you scratch your name at the bottom. Maybe it gets mixed up with someone else's cup once you've had a few too many drinks or something like that. And they found that in this shoemaker's shop, the base of a kylix, and it has the name Simon scratched on it. Wow. Right? How weird is that? So you would go from thinking this doesn't have the ring of truth about it, like it sounds like a satire, to thinking, imagine pulling that out of the ground and thinking, you'd immediately know. You'd be like, this is the guy that we're told Socrates was friends with, that was a shoemaker, right? So Socrates hung about in shops, and he, the famous anecdote is somebody said to him once, Socrates, you're kind of aloof from material possessions. You're always questioning materialism and stuff. And yet you spend all day hanging out, or you spend all afternoon hanging around in the Agora, which is this temple to consumerism. Like, it's where all the markets are and the kind of bustle of the city centre, like hanging out in a shopping mall. Like, how do you explain that? And Socrates said, I like to remind myself every day, I like to remind myself how many things there are of which I have no need. Like, which is typically kind of ironic of him. Like everything he said, and the famous thing about Socrates as well is Plato has him saying that his friends are sometimes not sure whether he's joking or not. But he's the sort of guy that I think in many cases is simultaneously joking and serious and deadly serious. Like somehow it's often that's why he's so kind of complex. He often comes across as if he's being ironic and joking, and yet he's never joking. Like he's in some sense he's always at the same time seems to be deadly serious about what he's saying. But it just somehow ends up being humorous. So that's what he'd do in the afternoon. And then in the evenings, supposedly he'd go and hang out in his friends' houses. And we see that in Plato's dialogues and stuff, like he'll go around and have dinner at a friend's house. Sometimes in the houses of very wealthy, influential, like I mean, it would be odd today because this is a guy that walks around with no shoes. And some people ridiculed him like he was like a dirty vagrant or something, you know. But at the same time, it would be like him having dinner with a cabinet minister, you know, or like or more, like you know, like with the prime minister or the president. You know, he was besties with Alcibiades, who at one point became almost like he was the commander in chief of the Athenian military and kind of being almost regarded as if he was about to become like an emperor of Athens. And that was one of Socrates' best friends. So he had a very complex social life. He was also known for talking to a wide variety of people, Athenians, men, but we're also told he spoke to several prostitutes, slaves, foreigners, people that were rich, poor, a dwarf, and perhaps most controversially of all, several women in ancient Athenian society. That was considered, you know, odd and controversial. Like to do philosophy with women would have been seen by many Athenians of the time to be perhaps more controversial than doing philosophy with slaves. And he, you know, he's unusual in that regard. Like the fact that he wanders about the street kind of doing philosophy with random people as well. He's a kind of opportunistic philosopher. Socrates, that's part of his character. You know, he just bumps in. Sometimes he's described just kind of bumping into people in the street. He's going somewhere. He's on his way somewhere. And he gets interrupted because he bumps into someone and they say, hey, Socrates, come and speak to this guy. Like, and he'll end up in what becomes a famous, celebrated philosophical debate. And that's not the norm for most philosophers. Even in antiquity, they usually would hang out with their students in their little school or whatever and do philosophy with their friends and other intellectuals, not just random people that they bump into in the street.
Yeah, what comes up when you share that is my kind of image of someone who's deep in the philosophical way of life. Obviously, there's exceptions, but generally likes things and ideas, and to kind of stick to their own crowd and read. Whereas Socrates seems to love other human beings. He seems to always want to be around and to socialize.
He's a hard person to categorize, but I get that feeling from him. The sense that I get from Socrates, to me, is that he comes across as someone who has a very profound love of human nature and human beings. Man, he wants to spend all of his time around people. He just wants to talk to people all day long. I keep telling people he reminds me of Jimi Hendrix. And I mean that quite seriously. Although, again, it sounds like I'm joking, right? Because Jimi Hendrix woke up Jimi Hendrix went to bed with his guitar in his bed. He woke up in the morning, strapped his guitar on and started cooking his breakfast wearing his guitar. He went to the lavatory wearing his guitar, allegedly. So psychologists call that time on task. He just had his guitar on all the time, right? And that's how Socrates is portrayed. He just he didn't have a job. right? He possibly used to be a stonemason, and then we're told that he quit doing that, and so that he could just dedicate his life to doing philosophy. And he just got up every morning and just did philosophy all day long, even with random people that he would encounter. So that means because he's using this questioning method, he's constantly honing his critical thinking skills all day long, every day. And it's inconceivable. Like, no one would do that. Our culture doesn't really admit of that today. So to imagine what a guy would be like, who literally just spent all day, every day. Sometimes we read these things in the ancient sources, and classicists will always tell us we can't take this too literally. Plato and Xenophon seem to be portraying Socrates in a somewhat semi-fictional way. But no one ever really disputes that. No one ever says Socrates didn't spend all day doing philosophy. That's ridiculous. It seems to be generally accepted that that's a plausible portrayal of him. So he was definitely, the Greeks refer to him as being having a great soul. There's a term that they use, megalosouchia, which literally means having a big psyche or big soul. Like, he's a towering character, like a unique individual, like in his era. So normally that term is used for great military commanders and famous politicians, but Socrates was one of these standout individuals. He must have had incredible charisma in a peculiar kind of way. And people say that when they met him, like, it was, a very kind of profound experience. But some people hated him as well. And of course, he was executed. He was placed on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety, and forced to drink hemlock when he was about 71, 72 years old.
Yeah, you go into that. The sort of second chapter of the book is titled "The Trial," and love because one of the books you recommend people read is The Apology, right? As like one of the best philosophy books ever.
No, I'm going to correct you there. Right, it's the only book that I recommend that people read. Like, I know sometimes I'll recommend books to individuals, right? But actually, I seldom do that. I think it's presumptuous to recommend books to people. People, it takes time to read a book, And so sometimes in coaching or therapy, I know a client quite well, a person I think you as an individual should maybe read this book. But in general, I don't recommend that people read books normally, with one exception, like Plato's Apology, because I think it's one of the most profound and moving and important texts in the history of the Western canon. And it only takes a few hours to read.
Why do you put that book in like a league of its own? What's special to you about that book?
Because, first of all, actually, this might sound a bit glib, but like I said a moment ago, it's relatively short. That means a lot to me, because someone could just sit down and read it in an afternoon. Like, anyone could have a go at it. What have you got to lose? It would be like reading a work of Shakespeare, like, and it only taking it's shorter than Shakespeare. Like, it would only take a few hours to get through it. It's pretty easy to read. Some of Plato's dialogues, like the Republic, is really long, and it gets quite dry in the middle, right? And kind of abstract at times. It's fascinating if you're a bit of a nerd for these things, but it's a bit much for somebody who's coming to it for the first time. But the Apology is pretty dramatic, because it's a courtroom drama, essentially, in a way. And Socrates condenses quite a lot of stuff in it. He says, and it's beautifully written. So I think it drops lots of kind of little seeds of philosophy. It doesn't have many complete arguments in it, but it has lots of little seeds of ideas that, you might read it and be thinking about it decades later, like, because it creates images in your mind. And it was hugely influential in the ancient world. If you want to understand any ancient philosophy, all ancient philosophers were familiar with Plato's Apology. It was like that famous. It was, it influenced everybody pretty much. And, sort of like someone like Marcus Aurelius, for example, would be like really familiar with it. It's a fundamental cultural reference point for basically all ancient thinkers. That's why one of the reasons why I think it's really important. But it was, for example, taken to be the most iconic example of what's sometimes called a good death or a noble death, right? So that was meant to be profoundly inspiring. I'll give you one illustration of that. 500 years later, Epictetus is teaching Stoicism. So to Epictetus, Socrates, by the way, is ancient history. It's like late medieval period to us or something, right? Like, this is 5 centuries earlier. Epictetus turns to his students and he says, people aren't upset by events, but by their opinions about them. The most famous quote in the Stoic literature, right? It used to be a cliche in cognitive behavioural therapy. It was in like every book on CBT. But no one ever quotes the next sentence, right? In the next sentence, Epictetus says, for example, so he gives an example of what he means. And he said, death, so you go straight for the jugular, right? Death itself is nothing terrible, because if it were, Socrates would have been frightened of dying, and he wasn't, right? So he said, this is a fundamental strategy that Socrates himself uses in the dialogues of both Plato and Xenophon. He'll often say to people when someone's scared of something or they're angry about something, he'll say, do other people all feel the same way about it that you do? And if the answer to that is no, people feel differently about this thing, then that would suggest that your fear of it, or your anger towards it is shaped by your beliefs, your opinions and your assumptions. Death seems like the most extreme example of something that we should fear. And yet, not everybody feels the same way about death, right? Some people actually are completely resigned to their own death. It's a really interesting one, because some people I know find that almost inconceivable, particularly I think younger people, right? And I think there's a reason for that. As you get older, I hate to break it to you kids, but as you get older, after 50, and you get into your 60s, 70s or whatever, like other people start dying that and so you're probably going to be bereaved multiple times. By the time Socrates was 71, 72, let's say, he'd probably seen loads of people dying. He'd served in the military and thousands of people had died around him. He'd seen tens of thousands of people die in the Athenian plague, right? But a lot of his friends had died as well, right? So he'd had plenty of opportunity to face up to and come to terms with his own mortality. And also, as you get older, you have brushes with death, either because you're in dangerous situations, like you're in a car crash or something, or you have a health problem, like you have a health scare and you get rushed into hospital, but it turns out you're fine. But for a minute you think, maybe this is it. And maybe my number's up or whatever. As time goes on, you have more and more opportunities to think, yeah, like maybe this is it. Like, maybe there isn't anymore. Maybe any minute now, like, or maybe in the next few days, like, it could be over. And I think as that happens to a lot of people when they're older and they have these multiple experiences of bereavement, multiple brushes with death themselves, a lot of people become more resigned to their own mortality, So Epictetus wants to point to Socrates and say, he's the cardinal example of this. Like, he was completely indifferent, like, to his own death. Partly, Xenophon says partly it was to do with his age. That's not the only reason, but part of it was that Socrates felt he'd had a good innings. He was about to become a burden to his family or begin losing his faculties. He talks a lot about this. He says, death is like someone who's lent you money and he makes you repay it a little bit at a time. He goes, I'll have your eyesight, I'm going to have your hearing, I'm going to have the strength in your legs now. He says old age kind of robs you, like it makes you pay your life back in one installment at a time. He wasn't sort of keen to go out like that. He wants to go out, Socrates wants to go out in a blaze of glory, in a sense. Or he wanted to make a statement on behalf of philosophy. He thought he could benefit Athenian society more by making this kind of principled stand in public than he could by continuing the same discussions that he'd been having for decades when he was starting to get on a little bit. That's part of, what we see going on there. But Epictetus is like, this guy's not afraid of dying. He shows complete indifference to it. He's ready to go. And because of that, people are amazed. They're like, you're about to be executed. You're standing trial in court, right? If the jury don't like you, you're going to be executed. Do you understand that? And Socrates is like, yeah, I understand it. It's not going to stop me from saying what I want to say. I'm not scared of dying. He says something remarkable as well about his military service at the beginning. I'll paraphrase. One of the first things he mentions in his defense is that he talks about his military service. Socrates was a hoplite, a heavy infantryman. And by the way, my personal view is that he wasn't an ordinary hoplite. He is depicted by both Xenophon and Plato discussing military training, by Xenophon discussing strategy and tactics in considerable detail. He's comfortable being consulted by Athenian generals and senior officers. He's more like a sergeant major, or in the Roman legions, he would have been like a centurion, I think, than just like a regular soldier. He knows a lot. He's studied warfare. He's experienced, and he's kind of like a mediator with senior officers, a go-between. So he says, look, I fought in 3 major battles in the Peloponnesian War. Lots of people died around him. He says, you guys praised me for my courage when I risked my life in order to protect the city walls of Athens. Now I'm standing here in court. You're talking as if I'm ridiculous for risking my life in order to defend philosophy. But this is infinitely more important to me, right? Because of what value are the walls of the city if the men that live within them are no good? If they're corrupt? So he said, doing philosophy and trying to improve my fellow citizens is more important to me than serving in the military. You praised me for risking my life doing that. I feel exactly the same way about risking my life right now in court. It's more important to me, right? That was part of how he, put his reasons for making the unapologetic. The Greek word for defense speech is apologia. And so that we get the English word apology. But Socrates is obviously completely unapologetic. He couldn't be less apologetic. In court. He carries on doing philosophy in the trial. When he takes the stand, he starts doing philosophy while interrogating the guys that are prosecuting him and bringing the charges against him. Weirdly, he's doing the very thing that they're putting him on trial for in the trial. They're going on about, you should stop doing philosophy, and he's like, well, tell me, define what you mean by, corrupting the youth and stuff like that. You're doing the thing right now that you're on trial for. That's how unapologetic he actually was. So he to borrow a phrase from Nietzsche, Socrates pressed his hand upon aeons as though upon wax during his trial. He sent shockwaves through the Greek world, and changed history by, this is a guy that never wrote a book, and he's the most iconic philosopher in the Western tradition. And part of it was also, he said some he helped to define the philosophical method as we know it today. And he tended to say things and come to conclusions that are so radical, whether we agree with them or not, they kind of, they stick in our minds and, force us to ask very deep questions. Often people would walk away from discussions with Socrates and think, I don't find these arguments convincing. And I'm not really sure what he's driving at. And I just can't buy his conclusions. They seem too extreme. But weeks, months, years, decades later, you're still thinking, about the stuff that he said because he pushed it further than most other thinkers would dare.
One of the things that Socrates said that you quoted him saying in the trial chapter of your book is that the evil of wrongly taking a life or inflicting other forms of unjust punishment is far greater than the evil of suffering it. In other words, the people that were going to execute him were really the ones suffering compared to him. A lot of people would be like, hang on a second.
Hang on a second.
Is that really the case? So I'm curious how you interpret that.
Yeah, that's a good example of something that Socrates says that sticks in your mind and should make you think, but it's kind of extreme and a lot of people would struggle to agree with it. Epictetus is, so often Socrates also will insinuate things or imply conclusions, not so much, to some extent in the Apology, but in the Apology is the least dialogical of the dialogues. It's the Apology is almost a monologue. There are little bits of dialogue in it, but it's more like a monologue. But in the other dialogues, there's a bit more back and forth. But Socrates will say these things, but sometimes in the discussion he'll be asking questions, and he'll kind of like he's spiraling around something. He's getting closer and closer to a conclusion, but he doesn't necessarily state it explicitly. Sometimes it's left. And that's partly because those dialogues come across as if, and I think we don't know for sure, but I think many scholars believe they're not like what we would think of as a philosophical book or a lecture. They're intended somewhat more as teaching aids that were created to inspire thinking. Their function is to make us think, not just to say, here's the conclusions that Socrates was kind of against this idea of just like handing down opinions that we would absorb passively. He says radical things on purpose to make us question, our thinking, and he poses tricky questions. But then what happens is that over time, the people that are responding to those dialogues often naturally say, well, this is what he seems to be implying. And they'll state it more explicitly than he ever would, right? So in Epictetus, again, like 5 centuries later, at the end of the Enchiridion, the handbook of Epictetus, he has this kind of quote that he attributes to Socrates that isn't in the Apology. So it's not clear whether he's kind of paraphrasing or maybe he's taking it from some other lost text, but it concludes with the words Anytus and Miletus, who are the two main guys that were prosecuting him, or suing him in court. In Greek, ancient Greek law, there wasn't a kind of, what do you call it, a crown prosecution service or whatever. Like the government or the police didn't press charges against people. You had to bring civil suits against people. So it had to be 2 other fellow citizens that would bring these charges to the court, and there weren't judges either. The jurymen kind of served as jurymen and judges, and there were more of them. There were 500 typically in a jury. So again, if you imagine he's in the court, it's like a huge mob of people, and fights would break out and things like that, right? It's somewhat, it's almost more like a sporting event or something than what we would think of as a trial. But Epictetus says, portrays Socrates as saying, Anytus and Miletus can kill me, but they cannot harm me, which is pretty hardcore thing to say, right? Like, again, he goes straight for the jugular. Like, it's the most extreme version that he can come out with. They can kill me, but it won't harm me. They could take away my property. They could destroy my reputation, but they can't harm me. Because what he's implying is that the only truly important thing in life is moral wisdom or something like that. That seems to be the position that Socrates circles around constantly, continually seems to be implying, although he often implies it or insinuates it, or is working towards it rather than just kind of explicitly stating it. But he clearly seems to be implying that moral wisdom of some sort is the most important, perhaps the only important thing in life. And taking someone's property, destroying their reputation, or killing them doesn't damage their moral wisdom or integrity. So it's of trivial or secondary importance. And in fact, being threatened with death simply gives him, in a sense, more opportunity to exercise moral wisdom and integrity in the face of extreme adversity, arguably, you know. He has, Seneca says, you know, one of the ironies is that you need to experience, in a sense, you need something resembling fear in order to exhibit the virtue of courage. Like if you just had no fear at all, like, then you wouldn't be able to exercise courage. Like if you're just like a kind of robot, be courageous. You know, can somebody who's kind of been lobotomized or like isn't capable of feeling anxiety be courageous? Like, can the same you need to experience some kind of desire or temptation in order to exhibit self-control and self-discipline. Like if you just don't desire, you know, if you're not hungry, then how can you exhibit self-control in relation to your appetite, right? Yeah. And Socrates in the trial, he says something like, he says, you know, he's talking about how he's not pleading for mercy. And he says, I'm a man of flesh and blood. And, you know, I'm not like I'm made of wood or stone. So he says, I have feelings, you know, but nevertheless, he stands up in front of the jury and tells them he's not afraid of dying. And the most important thing to him is he wants to honor philosophy and defend. He's not defending himself. He's defending philosophy in that trial, basically, you know, in a way that he made himself a martyr for philosophy. You know, 400 years before Christ, like he's a Christ-like figure in a sense, like somewhat, you know, couldn't be less like Christ in some ways. In other ways, really similar. Like it's an obvious comparison that many authors throughout history have made. Is like Socrates kind of dies for his belief in moral virtue and philosophy, and a bit like the crucifixion of Christ. And I'll tell you another weird thing about it. He strange coincidence. In the trial, there are kind of two phases to the jury vote. So they vote on whether someone's guilty or not, right? They narrowly find Socrates guilty. And then what happens is that the prosecution suggests a penalty, and the defendant suggests a penalty, and the jury vote to choose which one. So normally, like in a case like this, the people that are prosecuting would suggest the death penalty, and then the defendant would suggest exile or something like that, or a huge fine. And Socrates suggested that they should give him free meals for life as his punishment, right? Which was part of his big talk, like, but then he kind of backpedaled because of his friends, and he offered to pay a fine of 30 pieces of silver. Weirdly, like a bit like the biblical story of the betrayal of Christ by Judas Iscariot, and then they vote again, but he's condemned by a larger majority, which means, as it's often put, that some of the guys that thought Socrates was innocent actually then voted in favor of the death penalty somehow, because they were so provoked by the second speech that he gave regarding his alternative penalty. They were so kind of offended by that somehow that quite a few of them switched and said, a minute ago I voted to say you were innocent, now I think that we should execute you. Like, so remarkably, that was what happened during his trial.
I want to go back to some of the comments you made about Socrates not being afraid of dying. and how Epictetus uses him as a reference in the Enchiridion. So this is just something that I've been thinking about, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts. So if someone says that personally I've overcome the fear of death, we tend to think, this is a wise person. They're seeing death objectively as a natural process in life. There's nothing intrinsically bad about death. But then if you had the same attitude towards other people, like other people's deaths, neither good nor bad, it's nothing, then you may be seen as being a bit cold, and like, oh, there's something like, like socially. So how do you kind of think about those?
Well, more in terms of the distinction that the Stoics maintained that was central to their ethics between preference. So the Stoics thought there is this kind of paradox about our moral judgments, right? Let me think of a good on-ramp here. So the ideal, say, to pick a different situation, would be that we care about injustices that happen in the world enough to do something about them if we're able to, like to vote for a different government or whatever, but not so much that we become depressed or neurotic or really outraged in a way that's obviously harmful. So most people would agree that I should care about injustice, but not make myself neurotic, not get neurotic about it, right? So in a way, the Stoics are trying to tackle this problem and think, how is it possible to care enough about stuff that we would do something about it without driving ourselves nuts about it? And I think their solution is the only way that we can really do this is by making a distinction between two different types of value judgment, right? Because we don't have the conceptual apparatus to do this very successfully with the language that we have in our society, in an ancient Greek society. We need to make a more fine-grained distinction between one type of value judgment that says, I would prefer that politicians aren't corrupt, for example. Like, I would prefer it if politicians are honest. And I'll take action to change that insofar as it's within my power to do it, i.e. maybe by voting or something, or reporting corruption and being a whistleblower or something. If I have an opportunity to do something, then I do it. But not to invest so much value in it that I see it as something that intrinsically contributes to my quality of life. Like that I don't think that I have to have honest politicians in order to have a good life, right? My fulfillment, my fundamental goal, the goal in life, the most important thing to me in life doesn't depend on the world being perfect or politicians being honest or something like that. So when it comes to the suffering of other people, I think we have to make a similar kind of distinction, that I prefer it if other people like don't die in natural disasters and things like that. But I can't make my fulfillment depend on that. I mean, it would be crazy to, because it's a necessary part of human life that all mortals are born and die, and it's an intrinsic part of nature that some people die younger and some people die older and some people die peacefully in their bed and some people are like mauled to death by tigers or whatever. Like, or die of a horrible disease. Like, that's the way of the world, and it's how the world functions. And it'd be like kind of irrational, be kind of like crazy for me to wish that it just wasn't like that. What kind of world wouldn't be like that? Like if we all were immortal and walked around and never got any diseases or anything like that, then we would all die of boredom. I really think, strangely, like it's funny because people talk like that sometimes, but I find it quite hard to imagine this perfect world where there's no suffering and, challenges and, everything goes. So honestly, I think it would be incredibly dull. Like, so, there's a sense in which the unpredictability of life and the fragility of it are part of what makes it interesting, and part of what gives it its value. So we don't, generally speaking, we have no control over whether other people ultimately die or not. Like everybody, as the Greeks used to say, supposedly Socrates said this, but it's attributed to Anaxagoras as well. Someone said you've been condemned to die by the Athenians, and he said they've been condemned to die by nature. Like, we're all condemned to die. Some people sooner, some people later. Nature, like itself, like the gods have condemned them to die. Like, so the men who condemned me are themselves condemned. Like, they're just kind of like in denial of it. So, we have to recognize that that's a natural phenomenon, that it's kind of inescapable in a way, and that typically it's beyond our direct control, maybe with some exceptions. I might be able to dive in somebody to save someone from drowning or whatever, but for the most part, I don't have that much control over saving other people's lives. There's people dying, someone just died that very second somewhere in the world, probably. And throughout history, like, countless millions upon millions of people have lived and died, and will continue to do so in the future. So I think it's possible to have a kind of preference for one thing, or a dislike or a disapproval of another, while accepting or that we may not have control over it, and allowing our decisions and choices to be informed by that kind of preference or value judgment, but not viewing it as something that intrinsically contributes to our fulfillment, or the goal of life, as the Greeks tend to phrase it, and therefore not something that we should get highly distressed about, right? Like Socrates said, he's a man of flesh and blood, so he does have feelings. He's saddened to see the death of other people, but there's a difference between being sad about something and becoming clinically depressed about it. Like, we shouldn't see it as the end of the world, like, and the kind of something that ruins all of life for us. And another thing that changes the value that we attribute to external events is seeing the bigger picture, right? So while it's true that people die, and there's a tragedy to that, but also an inevitability about it. Everywhere in the world, this split seconds to a baby's being born, right, and someone's coming into existence, right. So, like, when you look at existence in the round, I mean, if you just sit and contemplate all the people dying, that'd be kind of depressing. But if you think about the fact that lots of people are being born and they have their whole life to look forward to, that's kind of maybe more inspiring. But the wise person would think of all of these things side by side. And so they'd have this kind of more nuanced, balanced, blended emotional reaction to events. And the Socrates, I think, and certainly the Stoics, would consider it irrational and a form of self-deception to place only the bad under a magnifying glass and get kind of tunnel vision for it, so that we're ignoring all of the positive or all the other aspects of life. Life would seem very dark if you only look at the kind of negative parts of it in isolation. But that's a lie. Like, it's a lie of omission, Like, and what is the emotional reaction? The appropriate feeling that we have when we think about the whole of existence in a rounded and balanced way. I don't know, but it's probably not a kind of extreme anger or extreme depression or extreme anxiety. At the very least, my perception is that, and from working with clients on altering the perspective, generally the most extreme emotional reaction occurs when you have this kind of narrow tunnel vision, and any broadening of perspective tends to moderate or dilute your emotional response. So again, you might think, well, this is a tragic thing that's happening, but because I'm aware there are lots of other positive things happening at the same time, I don't see it as depressing. Like, because there are things, to feel happy about and things to feel sad about simultaneously when I take a step back and look at the world.
Yeah, even as Epictetus advises, just imagining the same thing happening to a friend and what your reaction would be to that. It's the same kind of, it's a bit closer to home than the view from above, but it's changes things when you identify closely with yourself. It always hurts more. You always make it more magnified.
Definitely if you die. Like, when we think about other people, when we think about strangers dying, we kind of, especially if we take a step back from it and think about it objectively, we think, well, like, everyone dies eventually. But when we think about our own death, it seems like a cosmic injustice or something, like it's maybe we're more in denial of it or whatever. It seems odd that other people would be in denial of their mortality. You think, when you look at other people, you think, surely you should accept the fact that you're going to die eventually, and as you get older, the chances are more likely. That just seems like common sense when we're observing other people from the inside, but we're from the outside. But we're looking at things from the inside, from a first-person perspective. We have all these biases and blind spots that prevent us from being able. So I think really, fundamentally, one of the things that we get from Socrates is the idea that we can learn by observing other people's thinking, and it's difficult for us to critique our own thinking because we have these biases and blind spots. But if we critique other people, and we can do it in such a way that we see them as kind of analogous to us, we in a sense have a kind of empathy for people that we're debating with or engaging in philosophical dialogue with. We think, this guy keeps making these same errors, but maybe I do that as well sometimes, right? One of my favorite dialogues is the first Alcibiades, where Socrates tries to explain what the maxim that's engraved in the pillar outside the temple at Delphi means. The most famous philosophical maxim or Delphic maxim, there were many of them, but the most famous is gnothai se auton, which means know thyself, and has a profound effect on Greek philosophy. Socrates seems to keep coming back to it. And he says, to know thyself, he clearly thinks of as a kind of definition of wisdom. He compares it to an eye that can see itself, which is a really powerful and kind of evocative image, right? Yeah. He says, imagine the god Apollo is commanding your mind to know itself. He says, know thyself. Imagine he commanded your eye to see itself. He says this to Alcibiades, and Alcibiades says, I guess you'd need like a mirror or something. And Socrates says, well, what would be the mirror for the mind? And what he's implying or insinuating is that another person with whom you're engaging in a collaborative philosophical discussion would be like a mirror for your mind, and that would be like the eye being able to that can see itself. Like, you learn something about yourself by engaging very sincerely and very deeply in a debate with other people about what Socrates likes to describe as. I think some of the most profound things that Socrates says are just like him often saying quite simple things, right? So the very fact that he tends to refer to some of the things he's talking about is the most important things in life, like the highest things, he says. What he's implying is that one of the distinctive things about the dialogues that he's engaging in is that he keeps bringing the subject back to the most fundamental questions, such as what is wisdom? What is good for us? What is bad for us? What is the goal of human life? What does human fulfillment consist in? What is the nature of justice? These absolutely like fundamental questions about how we should live our lives and the things upon which we should place most value. So when we ask those really deep questions in a really sincere dialogue with other people, we learn more about ourselves. But I think, to me, my interpretation of what's going on in the course of Socrates' life is that he says in the Apology that initially, when the oracle said, no man is wiser than Socrates, and he thought, I need to go and check this out. I find it hard to believe. So I'm going to see if I can find someone that's wiser than me. What he says that he initially did was to seek out people that were known for wisdom. And when he questioned them, he found, mainly that makes us think of the sophists, because like the Greek word sophistes means an expert or someone who claims to be wise. The sophists were basically people who literally went around claiming to be wise and claiming to be enlightened, and their followers claimed that they were. So Socrates went, okay, I guess I should speak to these guys, right? Protagoras, the first famous sophist, was literally referred to as the wisest man alive, right? So Socrates went to him and was like, okay, like, can you explain what virtue is and how it can be taught and stuff like that, right? And when he questioned him very thoroughly, he found that Protagoras struggled to answer some basic questions, and he contradicted himself and he tied himself in knots. So Socrates thought, maybe these guys aren't really that wise then, right? And I'm only wiser than them because I at least realize that I'm ignorant of the answers to these questions, right? But there's something else going on here, which is Protagoras and some of these other guys became annoyed with Socrates and kind of evasive. So Plato often portrays them wanting to change the subject and kind of trying to, misdirect Socrates, launching into prepared speeches and kind of getting other people to step in for them in the conversation and things like that. So being kind of evasive, right? And Socrates says that he was surprised to find that sometimes he spoke with people who had no reputation for wisdom and found that they exhibited more wisdom than people who were famous wise men, right? So just like humble tradesmen and things like that. Socrates spoke to prostitutes and slaves and, all sorts of people. But I think part of it, what he's implying, and maybe this is even stated explicitly in one of Plato's dialogues, that people who claim to be wise are unsuited to philosophical discussion because they have too much of a reputation to defend. So that prevents them from ever admitting that they're wrong, right? So you could point out the contradictions in their thinking and the gaps in their reasoning. They're just going to get defensive when you do that and change the subject, right? Or try and gloss over it because they've basically poisoned the dialogue by investing their reputation in maintaining the appearance of wisdom, right? The appearance of wisdom is more important to them than real wisdom. And that's going to make them highly evasive. Like, it's going to make them resist ever having their errors being pointed out to them. So Socrates increasingly turned to a group of individuals that nobody considered to be wise. And those were the youth of Athens, like, who seemed much more open to, being interrogated by Socrates and having their errors. That's why I think that it's sometimes said he looks like over time he spends somewhat more time talking to younger people, and I think it's because he went, right, I'm going to go straight to the people that are called wise, the wisest men alive. And then he thought, these guys are like useless to talk to because they're so defensive, because they have to protect their reputation. Whereas slaves, prostitutes, and young people have got nothing to lose. Like, so if I ask them how they define justice, and then I kind of point out that there's maybe a flaw in their definition or there's a contradiction, they're more willing to accept that and to have another go and revise, what they're saying and to keep the conversation going. They don't have a reputation to protect. So they provide a better mirror, like, for my soul than, there's someone who claims to be wise is like a clouded mirror. It's not much good. Like, someone who has more intellectual humility is going to provide a better mirror.
Yeah, I can actually see that a lot in when I train jiu-jitsu. Sometimes when people get a black belt, it's like they're no longer open to learning from the lower belts. And it's like they've got to always maintain this authority when you talk to them. Whereas someone who's a white belt, they just like, I don't know anything. Like, we both don't know anything. And I really respect the black belts that still act like they don't know much, and they've got lots to learn.
Socrates avoided this. Sometimes the way I explain it is that he always avoided setting himself up as a teacher. Like, he didn't charge fees, whereas the sophists charged huge fees, right? So they're financially invested in maintaining a reputation. He didn't make any money from teaching. He never claimed to be a teacher. He avoided saying that he was a teacher. He denied being wise. And ironically, what he does is cast himself more in the role not of a teacher, but of a student, but of an exceptional student. Like, I guess you could say he's kind of got a beginner's mind, or whatever would be another way of maybe putting it, but he casts himself much more in the role of a kind of eternal student. And he would be a bit like, at the same time, it's almost humorous, like how annoying Socrates can be, but at the same time, kind of, that's part of his character, and this is what makes him inspiring. But it's like you went to a lecture by a famous public intellectual, and it's really expensive, and there's like hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people that went to see them, and there's one guy in the audience that is asking them really difficult, really penetrating questions, right? And some people might start to turn around and think, some people in the audience might think, this guy's kind of annoying, just let him get on with it. We all paid to come and hear this dude. But other people, the audience might be divided. There might be other people in the audience that think this guy's questions are more interesting than this dude's answers, right? And so it's almost like Socrates is like this guy at the back that everyone's starting to turn around and watch and think this dude's questions are better and more interesting than the expert at the front giving the answers. Yeah, but there would be people who hated him for that.
Yeah, I can see that. In the book, you talk about cognitive flexibility, and whenever I hear you talk about Socrates and I read about him, I feel like he's a master at trying on almost like different lenses or perspectives and flipping between them.
I think so. I mean, let me explain a little bit about something that was a little bit of an epiphany for me. Like, so one of the reasons that Socrates, sometimes people say, well, what did Socrates say? And it's hard to summarize what Socrates said because we have these dialogues mainly, and he does imply things, or sometimes he says things explicitly, but for the most part, what he bequeaths to us is a method. And I think that's part of his thinking. Some people, like the sophists, believed that wisdom consisted in knowing a bunch of stuff or holding correct opinions, and that you could sum it up in a speech. You could sum it up in maxims or slogans that people could buy from you, like buying onions from a greengrocer. They come along and pay you money, and you give them the speech, and now they're wise. They just memorize it. Like, you could write it down for them, and they could memorize the slogans, and they repeat it. And now they're going to be as wise as you are. They just repeat what you said. And so Socrates doesn't think of wisdom in terms of content. He thinks of it more in terms of process. It's a cognitive skill. He thinks there is no rule or maxim that's going to be true in every situation. There's always going to be exceptions to it. And wisdom for Socrates appears to consist more in being able to figure out the exceptions to a general maxim or a rule, to be able to think more flexibly and more creatively. I explain it to kids by saying Socrates is like this guy that whenever you say something, it's almost like he wants to say, yes, but. Right? So how would you define justice? And you go, I think justice is like helping your friends and harming your enemies. It's a classic Greek definition. Socrates' kind of response is just to go, yes, but, and then he'll come up with some kind of flaw in it or objection to it, right? So he's like, kind of acknowledges there's some truth in what you're saying, but there's also a shortcoming to it. There's always more. He's always very creatively thinking of situations where your idea, your definition, your role kind of breaks down. And so what we get from him more is this method of questioning. So the epiphany I had, I was reading Xenophon, and I was hesitant to write about Socrates. It's a presumptuous thing because people have been writing about Plato and Socrates since they lived, and many great scholars have written over the centuries about Socrates and Plato, to a lesser extent about Xenophon. And I thought, I don't, I'm not an expert. I have a degree in philosophy, but I'm not a Plato scholar. Like, I'm not an expert. It's just kind of hobby for me. And then one of the reasons I decided to write about it was because I was teaching my daughter about this stuff. And I thought, look, I just want to be able to communicate with people, about the benefit that I derive from it in the same way that I would talk to my daughter about it. Right. So I'm not, I'm not claiming to have the final word on Plato or to be able to compete with professional scholars, but I think maybe I can express some of the ideas in a way that would be engaging, give people an on-ramp, to go and read the dialogues and so on. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that I have an unusual background. My background is interdisciplinary. So my master's degrees was in an interdisciplinary centre in Sheffield, where we studied sociology, anthropology, philosophy, psychiatry, like psychotherapy. And I've always I came from a background of philosophy, and then I trained in lots of different types of psychotherapy. And then I got into kind of studying classics and history. So I combine these different disciplines to some extent. And reading Plato, and particularly Xenophon, actually, as a psychotherapist, I think I noticed stuff. It seemed to me I was noticing stuff that classicists and philosophers just never mentioned. And when I'm lucky enough to, over the years, having written books and speak at conferences, I'm friends with and know lots of classicists and philosophers. And I'd say to them, like, have you noticed this thing that Plato says or this thing that Xenophon says? And they'd often noticed it, but hadn't thought it was significant, or they just hadn't noticed it at all. The stuff that leaps out at me is because sometimes it's just weirdly similar to stuff that we would do in cognitive therapy. But one of them is in one of Xenophon's dialogues. Socrates is talking to yet another adolescent boy, and he's in the Agora in a saddlery, like it sells saddles for horses. So just like we described before. And he gets talking to this young guy called Euthydemus. There are two Euthydemuses, one in Xenophon and one in Plato. This is Xenophon's Euthydemus. And Socrates says to this guy, listen, I've heard all about you. You've got a reputation for having this amazing library, private collection of books on self-improvement. He's a self-help junkie, like really familiar in modern psychotherapy. Half the clients that we see in therapy have got libraries of self-help books. They're self-help junkies, right? And this is exactly what this young guy is like. And he says, yeah, I collect the maxims of the wise for my own improvement, right? He's a self-help junkie. Like, he's got all the books, he's got all the best-selling books of the time and stuff. And Socrates gets in a conversation with him about that. And he basically questions him. He says what he wants more than anything else is to be a great statesman and to demonstrate that he really understands the nature of justice. And so Socrates questions him about the nature of justice, and within a few minutes shows that he's contradicting himself, and he's confused and he doesn't really understand it. So again, he's been passively just kind of parroting stuff from books, but he hasn't got the cognitive skill, like, of being able to do critical thinking. Like, he can't employ these concepts. Like, he's just repeating stuff that he's read without really understanding it. And so Socrates is trying to show him, like, to really understand the nature of justice, you need to, be willing to debate it and to kind of explore it from different perspectives and turn it over in your mind and so on. It's going to take work, like practicing playing the guitar or something like that. It's a skill. It's a practical skill, like, that we're learning. But then this is the bit that jumps out at me. Socrates says, let me show you. And he draws a diagram. So I was like, no one told me Socrates drew a diagram. Like, I mean, he does draw other diagrams, but no one told me he drew this diagram. And he draws two columns, probably on a wax tablet, I'm guessing. Like, and we do 2-column diagrams all the time in cognitive behavioural therapy. There's probably someone doing it right now as we speak somewhere in the world, right, with a flipboard with a CBT client. And we use it for different things. But what Socrates uses it for, so we all do, typically we'll get a negative belief that a client has, like, nobody likes me, everybody hates me or something, right? And the cognitive therapist will say, where's the evidence for that? let's draw two columns, and we'll have the evidence for that belief on one side and the evidence against it on the other side, right? And then we'll go through it, and the evidence that you think is for it, then maybe we'll do a second round and we'll go, is this evidence real? Or could it be possibly interpreted differently or challenged, right? So we'll kind of like start to question the placement of things in the column. We'll also do two columns and weigh up the pros and cons of holding a belief or using a particular strategy, right? And then again, someone might say, these are some of the pros of avoidance. Like, at least when I avoid situations that make me feel anxious, it makes me feel temporarily better. And so the therapist might then go back and question that and say, but is that an illusion, right? Is that really a pro, or is there really a disadvantage there? Because maybe it alleviates your anxiety temporarily, but makes you more sensitive in the long term, like more vulnerable over the long term. So maybe that's not really an advantage. Maybe it just seems like one, right? And so we start to question the evaluation of the pros and cons in that way. There's a couple other variations, but those are the ways that we typically use the two column diagram. So Socrates draws two columns, and he says, okay, so you want to be a statesman and understand the nature of justice. Let's put justice at the top of one column and injustice at the top of the other. He says, give me some examples of injustice. And Euthydemus says that's easy. Lying and stealing and stuff like that, right? And Socrates says, okay, and this is where the Socratic method proper begins, the next step. So he says, lying. So now Socrates isn't just following a formula, he's actually thinking creatively. He's coming up with creative examples, right? Not following some standard formula. He has to think on the fly. So he says, okay, it's lying and stealing. What if an elected general in a war lies to the enemy? Is that injustice, or is that potentially just? And Euthydemus is like, well, that's different, right? Like, that's an exception to the rule, or the different, that would be just. Socrates says, you said stealing was unjust, but what if he captures an enemy camp and steals their weapons? Is that unjust, or would we consider that to be just in the rules of war? And Euthydemus says, okay, that's just, that's an exception. Socrates says, okay, what about in civilian life? If a parent is trying to give medicine to a small child and they won't take it, but they know they need to help them, so that the parent hides it inside the food and deceives the child. Like, is that unjust, or is that justified form of deception? Euthydemus is like, okay, well, that's different as well, right? Like, it's kind of an exception. And so then Socrates uses an example that's like a famous one throughout the centuries that philosophers love. So what if your friend is suicidal? Like, and they ask you, where did you put my dagger? Like, so would you consider it unjust to tell them a white lie and say, I don't know, I can't remember where your dagger is, like, in order to save their life, or and Euthydemus is like, okay, well, yeah, that's different, man. It's a white lie. You're doing it to save somebody's life, to help them. So what Socrates is basically teaching is a cognitive skill here. It's a form of cognitive flexibility where you're able to, think outside the box, to use a horrible modern cliche. Like, you've got this kind of rigid definition, like, of justice. It consists, in telling the truth and not stealing and stuff like that. But is there more nuance to it? Like, actually, if you really understand justice and injustice, then, are there possibly exceptions to it? And in different situations, might you interpret the meaning of the word somewhat differently? And, you can't teach that by just getting someone to memorize a formula. You have to get them to think through lots of examples, right? And at the end of it, they might even say, I'm not sure that I could necessarily, they revise their definition of what justice means, but they might never get to a perfect definition, but it still seems like they've got a better understanding by the end of it, because they've gone on this journey of thinking through all the exceptions. It takes time to do. It's a skill. You can't just get that from someone giving you a lecture and you going away and memorizing what they've said. So Socrates says, we draw these two columns. Are there any circumstances under which we would move something from one column into the other column? So that, you said that lying is unjust. Would you ever move it across into the column marked justice, in some situations? And he says the same thing. Then Euthydemus eventually says to him, listen, I want to study philosophy and learn this skill. Where should I begin? And Socrates then says to him, this is how you should begin, right? And he says, where you should begin is by asking yourself what eudaimonia consists in, or fulfillment. This would seem logical from an ancient Greek point of view. He says it's your definition of what is good and bad, basically, because that's how an ancient Greek would define eudaimonia. Right? It's having everything that's good and avoiding everything that's bad, basically. So he says, list all the things that you think are good for us in life, like wealth and reputation and having a big house and all this kind of superficial stuff he would come up with initially. Then Socrates says, can you think of any situations in which the things that you listed as good might potentially be bad? So he says health is the most obvious example of something that's intrinsically good. And Socrates says, well, what if you live in a dictatorship and the tyrant that rules it is recruiting people to engage in an unjust war where everybody's going to get killed? Then being healthy might be a disadvantage, right? Socrates' favorite example as well was of reversal of fortune, is that under the dictatorship of the 30 tyrants in Athens, the oligarchy, towards the end of his life, they went round and executed lots of people that had money and status. Because if you had status, you were a threat to them, and if you had a lot of money, they wanted to seize it for themselves. So people before had complained that they were poor, and they had no status in Athenian society. And Socrates, after the oligarchy, probably annoyingly, would go up to them and say, don't you think you're better off now? Because the 30 tyrants rounded up anybody that had status and money and garroted them and threw them in a pit, in order to steal their wealth. You're lucky. You're poor. It didn't work out so well for the rich and famous of Athenian society. So sometimes it can be surprising how things work out, right? Losing your job might be the best thing that ever happens to you, right? I mean, getting sick might be one of the best things that ever happens to you. You might really learn something from it. It might cause you to view things from a different perspective. It's difficult to predict, how things are going to. Often, when you look, it's easier in retrospect as you get older. You look back over your life. It sounds crazy at first to say this, but when you're older and you look back on your own life and you think, what are the things that benefited you the most over the course of your life? And you might look back and think, some of the things that actually benefited me the most were a relationship that went didn't work out, or failing an exam, or some of the things that made me who I am today were setbacks, and misfortune. So it seems we have to have a more nuanced perspective. We have to have more cognitive flexibility and being able to look at things from multiple alternative points of view, to see the possibilities that are intrinsic in them. But also in modern psychology, we know that this kind of cognitive flexibility that is Socrates is training people to develop through using this 2-column technique, thinking of exceptions to the rules, always generating alternative ways of looking at things, is associated with emotional resilience, better relationships with other people, better psychological well-being. Yeah, whereas rigidity in our thinking tends to be associated with depression and anxiety and other mental health problems. So it's the skill of the Socratic method, that we obtain from Socrates, that maybe is one of the most valuable things. Maybe flourishing actually consists in this ability to ask questions and think about things in a more flexible and creative way. But one of the reasons I'm emphasizing that is I don't think this is acknowledged in modern self-help literature, generally speaking. I think when you read modern self-help books and you watch videos, the self-help books give self-help advice. They give answers. They recommend maxims and strategies and techniques. But like with the ancient sophists, that risks encouraging a kind of passivity and rigidity in our thinking. Modern research, there's cognitive flexibility, which is our ability to kind of view things creatively from different perspectives. That's linked to empathy, It's linked to our ability to kind of snap out of unhealthy patterns of thinking as well. But there's also something closely related to it called coping flexibility, which is our ability to be able to choose wisely and adaptively between different ways of coping with problems. I mean, the simplest example of that is sometimes when you're dealing with other people, it's important to be able to speak up and assert yourself. Other times, I hate to break it to you kids, sometimes you'd be better off zipping it, and saying nothing in some situations. But a really smart person will be able to pick their battles, and choose. But if you think I have to confront, attack, assert myself every time, that generally doesn't work out that well, to be honest. Even though many people believe that that's healthy. And likewise, always kind of avoiding things and kind of being resigned and accepting doesn't work. Sometimes you need to be able to speak up, but you have to pick your situations. I think Epictetus talks about something very similar to this, but he recognizes that for Stoics, there's this problem. He's famously, he says, how does the bull know that it can kill a lion? Seems like an odd remark to make, right? I didn't know bulls could kill lions, but I did a bit of research on it. Oh boy, they can. So a bull that's in charge of a herd can toss a lion in the air on its horns, make mincemeat of it. But the calves aren't strong enough to fight off a lion. Only some of the bulls are powerful enough, strong enough to do that. So Epictetus said, how would you know that you could fight a lion? Well, the only way that you would really know is through trial and error. So I think what he has in mind is most ancient philosophers had some experience of martial arts. They did pancration or wrestling or boxing. It's surprising to us now, but even Marcus Aurelius, who was a bit of a weedy nerd, was definitely trained in wrestling and boxing and alludes to it in the Meditations. So did most people, in Greek and Roman society. So they're very familiar with the idea of choosing a sparring partner, right? And this becomes a metaphor for life on many levels. But part of it is, if you choose somebody that's too easy to fight, and you're really experienced, you're a big, strong guy, and you're really fast and you're really skilled, it's going to be you're going to have a sparring partner that's too easy, and you're not going to learn, they're not going to be that much of a challenge for you, right? Perhaps. But if you pick somebody who's twice your size, and way more experienced, much stronger and much faster than you, then you're just going to get your butt kicked, right? And maybe you learn something from that, but it's not going to. You'd be better to pick someone who's more, generally speaking, who's more evenly matched. We said earlier you can learn from novices and stuff as well, but for the most part, you want to pick somebody that's, if you're sparring with, you might want to pick somebody where you think there's kind of a chance that they might beat you, a chance that you might win, or they're reasonably evenly matched. They're not just going to beat you within the first 2 seconds every time or something and it's not going to be, there's not going to be much opportunity to learn stuff perhaps, right? So Epictetus says you can only judge this from experience. You through trial and error, you kind of figure out what's too much and what's not enough is a challenge. And in terms of Stoicism, how can you, if you can use Stoicism, for example, psychologically, to endure pain, to resist temptation, how do you know? For some people, being promoted to a position of power, they lose their mind. Some famously in politics, power corrupts, right? And whereas other people are kind of unfazed by that, right? How would you know? But you have to observe yourself very closely in similar situations and think, I know that, this is a weakness for me or it's a strength for me, right? And so deciding whether it's a good idea to face certain challenges, or you'd be better off avoiding them because it's too much, it's going to overwhelm you. You know, everyone has to decide that for themselves. There's not a standard formula, right? No one is like, unless you're the Stoic sage, you can't throw yourself into every challenging situation because some of them are going to be too much for you. Like it's going to be depressing, or you're going to lose your temper, you're going to succumb to temptation. Like, unless you're saint-like, and you've completely mastered all fear and anger and desire in yourself. And some challenges are going to be a piece of cake for you. But we have to know ourselves. We have to study our strengths and weaknesses and figure out, on the basis of self-knowledge, what would be an appropriate coping strategy for us in different situations, right? And that takes thinking. It takes coping flexibility. It takes, also a part of it is evaluating what aspects of a situation you have control over and which aspects you don't have control over. In some situations, the way you cope might depend on how much time you have, right? So generally,
wisdom, would you say? It sounds like it's practical wisdom, what you're describing.
Yeah, it's a form of practical wisdom. I think often people think, again, you can just get like a bunch of formulas from a book. I mean, I don't mean to pick on any one individual because there are lots of self-help books of this kind, but I will pick on one because it just jumps out at me, right? So there's this guy you may have heard of called Jordan Peterson, right? Who has a book called 12 Rules for, what's it called? 12 Rules for Life or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And the reason that one always sticks in my mind, it's not so much the content of the rules or like the other stuff that he says, but the foreword, which he didn't write, of that book, amazed me when I read it because I've read it several times because I kind of couldn't believe it, right? The guy who's a psychoanalyst and a neuroscientist, I believe, who wrote the foreword, actually spends quite a lot of it valorizing rigid rule-following behavior, right? So it's a book about 12 rules. He begins by comparing them to the 10 Commandments, right? Doesn't go quite as far as to compare Jordan Peterson to Moses, but he kind of gets pretty close. So he says, we've got these 12 rules. They're a bit like the 10 Commandments. It's not the 20. He says at one point, he says it's not the 10 suggestions, or the 10 guidelines, the 10 Commandments. Sometimes people need strict, clearly defined rules to follow, right? And the reason I thought that was weird is that he doesn't mention, and I guess it kind of sounds like he's not aware of. I can't believe that John Peterson isn't, though. There's a body of research literature that's quite influential in modern behavior therapy, that deals with what we call the problem of rule-governed behavior. And the problem with rule-governed behavior is, to cut a long story short, a number of research studies, influential research studies, have shown that when people try to follow rules like this that seem kind of quite absolute, like commandments, it tends to lead to rigidity and a lack of coping flexibility, right? So it's kind of the opposite of what we want. So it's a hazard, well-known hazard in modern psychotherapy, that if you're too prescriptive and you just tell people, hey, just follow this strategy or something. Now, ironically, one of the 12 rules that Jordan Peterson gives is that you should tell the truth or at least never lie, which happens to be almost identical to one of the definitions of justice that Socrates disputes in this dialogue by Xenophon. So Socrates uses this as almost the same thing as an example of a maxim or a rule that's overly simplistic, right?
Yeah.
That was 2,400 years ago, right? But also in modern psychology, like in cognitive behavioural therapy, we have the same understanding that often, because when we assess clients in the first session, we ask them, what do you currently do to cope with your depression? What do you currently do to cope with your anxiety? And people have coping strategies that they've either come up with themselves, or they've got off the internet, or from self-help books that they've read. And often they're using them maladaptively. Otherwise, why would they be in the consulting room, right? And to be fair, this is more of a problem with people in psychotherapy than with the non-clinical population, so-called normal population. Although in my experience, they're not that normal sometimes. But people that don't have clinical depression or anxiety might not experience this as such an issue. We tend to become more, unfortunately, we become more rigid in our rule following the more we experience stress or the more we experience strong emotions like anxiety, depression, or anger. Then the coping strategies that we apply more in a black and white, rigid, absolutistic kind of way. And then that just tends to lead to more and more problems. So the first thing we do is identify the coping strategies that people are using, and often we have to ask them to quit using them. Because the reason in therapy is because these strategies are backfiring. And it might be because people are applying them too rigidly and overextending them, or that they've somehow turned them into subtle forms of avoidance, or that they have disadvantages that they haven't really thought through. I'll give you an example. This is another one of John Peterson's 12 rules, actually. Sometimes people have been told that if they stand up straight and they kind of put their shoulders back and they have fake it to make it and they have confident body language and look people in the eye, that's going to make them more confident, right? And give them social confidence, right? For instance, that's quite common among certain clients, right? But what they might not realize is that many different self-help techniques, if someone is prone to social anxiety, or social phobia, as it's called in the extreme form, social anxiety disorder, then one of the main maintaining factors for social anxiety is heightened self-focused attention. We know that beyond a shadow of doubt, right? So the problem with self-help techniques in that context is that a great many self-help techniques actually increase self-focused attention. So if I try to control my breathing or relax my muscles or change my posture, it forces me to focus more attention on myself than normal. And that increases social anxiety in social situations. So changing your posture and stuff might actually work in situations where you're not that anxious, or it might work in situations where you're not the center of attention or whatever. But if you have social anxiety and you feel that people are looking at you, and then you try and change your posture, you're probably going to double or treble your self-focused attention and make your anxiety much worse. Right? And many self-help techniques indirectly have that same backfire in a similar way. So in therapy, usually, again, it's just a question of sitting down with people and going, what do you think are the pros and cons of using this technique? Because in some ways, all self-help techniques have some advantages, but they also all have disadvantages as well. So what's usually missing is that in books, you get overly kind of prescriptive, one-size-fits-all advice. And then people under duress will apply it even more rigidly, insensitive to changes in the environment, not really weighing up the consequences. And the more anxious they get, the more they'll hang on to this clutching at straws of, this technique. But what needs to happen is to think through the consequences of it. And also another way of doing the 2-column technique is to say, let's say there's a good way and a bad way of changing your posture, for instance, or faking it to make it, or there's a good form of mindfulness and a bad form of mindfulness. What would the difference be? How would you identify healthy mindfulness and what might cross over into unhealthy mindfulness? How do you distinguish between the good and bad versions of this concept? And again, just teaching people to reflect on things and question them. It might sound simple. Well, you do that. That happens in almost all cognitive therapy. It's something that's a little bit more intangible because it's an experience. It's a skill that comes from thinking things through. That often is completely missing from, especially if you get a self-help book and it says treat this like the 10 Commandments, kind of thing. That's really doing the opposite and risks discouraging. Although, to be honest, I think John Peterson himself later in his book does acknowledge that there are exceptions to some of these rules. But even the language of prescribing rules and things, and certainly comparing them to 10 Commandments. And when I first read that, it struck me as being obviously at odds with what we normally do in psychotherapy and what the research literature shows about rule-governed behavior and the problems associated with that. So I wanted to emphasize that, because when I talk to people about self-help, this comes up over and over and over again. Like, the world is full of self-help junkies who wind up in psychotherapy. And they say, I don't understand it. I've read all these self-help books and I'm really, really trying hard to fake it till I make it. I'm really trying hard with my mindfulness and stuff like that. And I'm just getting worse. It kind of feels like it's helping, but I'm not really getting better. Right. You hear that a lot. And you think, well, you have to analyze what you're doing and evaluate it more critically, and figure out the pros and cons and how you would tweak it or adjust it to suit different situations. And maybe mindfulness, and maybe speaking your mind, and maybe changing your posture isn't the best strategy in every situation, right? Maybe in some situations you want to do something different. That's coping flexibility, right? It's this coping flexibility, actually, and the ability to think on your feet a little bit more. And I hate to break it to you, kids, you're going to have to think for yourselves, right? But the ability to think for yourselves is the main thing, actually, beyond any rules that anyone can give you. Like, there's one of the main things that's going to contribute to genuine emotional resilience across situations. What research on coping shows is that nobody typically develops emotional resilience by just depending on one strategy all the time. Like, genuinely resilient people use different techniques and different strategies in different situations. They're more adaptive. But that's a skill. It may be the very fact that we become overly dependent on lists of rules is one of the sources of our psychological problems. We're too passive in that regard. That's in a way, the Socratic method is addressing that same problem.
I consider myself to have, over the years, been a bit of a self-help junkie. But I think, just listening to you now, one of the things I've always really enjoyed doing is challenging what I'm reading, and almost like getting really into something and then asking a bit later, are there problems with this? Are there flaws with this? And so I've read 12 Rules for Life. I enjoyed it, but I also love hearing your kind of critique of it and realizing that, yeah, there's going to be problems and flaws within it. And I think that stops me being overly reliant on one way of perceiving a rule and can kind of flip between different ideas.
The other one, I'll just throw another one in the mix here, right? He has a chapter in it about corporal punishment for small children. He says 2-year-olds, actually, right? And so I think sometimes Jordan Peterson is just being a bit contrarian. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, right? He just wants to say something a bit unique, a bit different. So he says that he talks about flicking a small child in the back of their hand with your index finger, which kind of stings when you do it, right? Like, now, I'm an expert on corporal punishment because when I was a kid, I was in trouble every day. And we had this thing in Scotland called a toss, which was a leather strap that the teachers kept in their desk. And I got the strap, as we called it, across the palms of my hands, like once a week or something, constant. But then this highlights problems with it, right? So I find it strange that Jordan Peterson references B.F. Skinner, because I read Skinner when I was 17, and it was a revelation to me, because Skinner, who's one of the pioneers of operant conditioning and an expert on reward and punishment, generally thought that punishment, like corporal punishment, wasn't very effective as a way of shaping behavior. And strangely, Peterson seems to think that Skinner supports what he's saying, but I would have thought Skinner said the complete opposite. And I agreed with Skinner. Skinner said, there are many problems with using punishment as a form of shaping behavior. It's complicated. There are pros and cons to doing it. It's not like you can just punish a kid and it's always going to extinguish their behavior. Number one, and I was like, I'm an expert in this because I've had so much punishment as a kid. He said, number one, beyond a certain point, it becomes ineffective, right? And I was like, yeah, it doesn't hurt anymore. So kids that had never had the strap were terrified of it. I had it so often it didn't bother me anymore. Actually it gave me a buzz because it made me feel like a tough guy. I just like, teacher gave me a strap, then, but like, you know, so it made you kind of like, it had the opposite of the desired effect, right? And then the other thing would be if you do something, commit a crime, and you evade punishment, you get what's called negative reinforcement. So you get a buzz from avoiding punishment, right? I think the famous example of that is that you have a dog that jumps up on your couch. So you whack it with a newspaper, like rolled up newspaper, you know, is the old example that people would give to teach your dog it's not to jump up on the couch. And it kind of works because the dog's like, oh, I don't want to get whacked with the newspaper and jump on the couch. But every day when you go out to work, your dog's like, he's not around anymore. And now it's like, I'm definitely going to get on the couch. Like, because not only do I quite like getting on the couch, I'm also getting a buzz out of the fact that I'm able to do it without getting whacked because I've beat the system. Right, like he's not around like at the moment, so like, you know, like it's a thrill. And criminals like often like after a certain point get a buzz out of committing crimes and dodging the police, right? Like there's a certain satisfaction that comes that we call negative reinforcement. It's a technical term for it. This kind of says that these are all. The other thing is like if you have to increase the level of punishment for it to continue to be effective. But beyond a certain level, you break individuals and they just become completely demoralized and kind of depressed. So, you know, either the kids get used to the punishment in some cases, or you have to punish them so severely, you just destroy them and traumatize them. Like, basically, you know, it's much better to shape behavior through strategic use of positive reinforcement and good role modeling and stuff like that. Basically, so I'm not saying this stuff just for the sake of disagreeing with Jordan Peterson, but it's a good example of how, okay, sure, like punishing, giving kids the strap or flicking them in the back of the hand maybe works sometimes, but there's pros and cons to doing it. And in some situations, it might actually achieve the complete opposite. I got punished like crazy when I was a kid. The main thing it did to me was just make me incredibly rebellious, right? And actually, one of the things it did to me was make me really angry. Like as a teenager, like I was always kind of plotting how I was going to get my own back against school teachers and stuff like that. And one of the ironies about that, again, is a kind of reversal of fortune, is because I was so consumed with anger as a teen, quite early on in life, I kind of began to question it, right? And I thought, I can't go on like this. I'm just consumed with rage, like about, you know, like the people, like, you know, give me the strap and things like that and other things. So I thought I have to do something about my anger. Like, and so by the time I was in my mid-20s or something like that, I got to the point where I didn't really have that much anger anymore, because ironically, I had so much anger, I was forced into a position where I had to do something about it and change it. And that was partly why I became interested in Stoicism. You know, it was through doing Buddhist meditation and reading loads of self-help books and reading Seneca's on anger and getting into Stoics that helped me to kind of cure myself of this anger that I'd inherited from, you know, I think, like, as a response to like excessive corporal punishment. Because that happened in the schools, it also happened at home. And that happened to all my friends as well. Like, when I was a kid, my mother had a drawer and it was full of leather straps. Like, and so sometimes all she had to do was she would go and just put her hand on the handle of the drawer and look at me. Like, and that was my signal. You know, she was like, if you don't watch out, if you don't behave, then I'm going to open the drawer, get the strap out, give you the strap. So I got strapped at school, I got strapped at home. But again, the thing was, after a while, it was more the kind of indignity of it or something. Like, it didn't actually hurt that much, right? So this is another example of something it seems like, and in the 12 Rules, Jordan Peterson presents corporal punishment as an effective way of shaping the behavior of small children. But in some situations, not only will it fail to work, it will potentially have the complete opposite of the desired result. So, yeah, I think the real self-improvement strategy is the one that is described by Socrates, you know, which is to see beyond these rules and maxims and coping strategies and learn to question them, like to think of situations where the definition of justice or courage or wisdom doesn't apply anymore, or where something that seems good for us or healthy might be bad for us or unhealthy. That's familiar to me because it's normally what we have to do in cognitive therapy. Anyway, very often you say to clients, what do you think the pros and cons are? But having said that Socrates thinks we gain insight from working with other people, and that's, why we have his philosophy in dialogue form in part. The best way to weigh up the pros and cons, and it's a shame because I don't think people have. Part of the problem here is modern society. Like we get self-help information from videos and off the internet. But one way that you would normally see beyond these kind of rigid strategies and rigid rules is in a group of other people. If you say, hey, I think it's really useful to practice mindfulness as a way of coping with different forms of anxiety. And someone in the group might say, well, I tried that, but I found that I've got health anxiety, and that makes me scan my body obsessively for the slightest little twinge and interpret it as a symptom. So when I was doing mindfulness, that actually just seemed to magnify that. Like, it made me pay even more attention to the symptoms of my body. And someone else might have social anxiety, like we mentioned earlier, and they might say, well, I practice mindfulness, and that just heightened my self-consciousness in social situations. I had to train myself to do the opposite and focus more attention outwardly on the audience in order to cope with it. And then someone else might say, well, I had that problem, but I figured out a solution to it, right? So in a group, you'll often get a discussion going about the pros and cons of different strategies. My experience has been one of the most useful. I used to teach therapists for many years. And one of the most useful things that I would do is I'd teach a technique, and then I'd say, what do you guys think of the pros and cons of this technique? Mm. And then I'd say, how could you maximize the pros and make even better use of them? And how could you minimize or prevent the cons or disadvantages? Like, in the group, brainstorming together and sharing different perspectives is a really, by the end of it, then you potentially have a much more nuanced understanding pretty quickly of the genuine pros and cons of using different techniques. It's a little bit harder to get that on your own. I think, in my experience, it's easier to get that when you talk to other people.
One question I wanted to ask you is, have you played around with artificial intelligence, large language models? Because I've been playing around with using ChatGPT as a way to like impersonate Socrates and to kind of quiz me, and it's almost like an interactive exercise where I can just, might not be perfect, but at least it gets me thinking and refining my thoughts. What do you think about that?
It's a really interesting question. First of all, I'll say there are many things about the ancient Socratic dialogues that seem weirdly contemporary to me, right? One completely at a tangent that I just mentioned in passing is the sophists mainly talk to adolescent boys. That's their audience. And so Plato portrays them to some extent as playing on their insecurities about their masculinity. So talking to them about, if you want to be a real man, like, then you'd emulate political tyrants more. They don't care about other people's ideas of social virtue or justice. And when I read that, I think these guys sound an awful lot like influencers in the manosphere today, weirdly, who have a kind of similar audience, actually. Like, it dawned on me one day that they're saying this stuff partly because their audience is mainly 15-year-old boys, right? So it's kind of no coincidence that a lot of it seems to emphasize strength and virility and defining that as true masculinity, like, because that's their anxiety. So I read stuff like that and I think, wow, it's spooky how contemporary that is. But another thing is, I talk a lot about Socrates notoriously, particularly in a Platonic dialogue called the Phaedrus, kind of expresses concerns about books. And he thinks that books provide limited understanding, that you can't ask a book questions, although you can ask AI questions to in a sense, like, although, not in the way that you can a human, though, perhaps. But he says, like, the problem with reading books is you kind of delegate your understanding. You get opinions from books, potentially. And the risk is you'll just repeat what you just read stuff in a book and then you'll parrot it and repeat it without really understanding it or having figured it out through trial and error yourself. So some of the concerns that he expresses about books or writing are eerily similar to concerns that people have today about becoming overly dependent on AI. Like basically his concern is that we're delegating our thinking to another source and just kind of passively, getting opinions. I've just read a book and now the stuff I believe is just what I read in this book, rather than stuff that I've actually figured out. Socrates says that's opinion, not knowledge. Like, because you can't really explain how you arrived at that. It's just someone else's conclusions. That said, I think there's a lot of value in AI. It's a little bit like talking to an alien, right? It says things, it has strengths and weaknesses. Like, it has weird weaknesses that, at the moment that humans don't have. But it also has, in some ways, it can be more rounded and balanced and more impartial than humans be. It has some language skills that are better than most humans. One other advantage is you can relentlessly question it in a way that humans would get fed up with. So in terms of Socratic diet, you can argue till the cows come home with AI, about picking holes in its reasoning and stuff like that, and kind of quizzing it in fine detail. And actually, the truth is, it's often difficult to do that with other humans because a lot of people don't have the patience for it. So I've found it as a kind of sparring partner or a tool quite useful, but I think I find it useful more as a way of helping me to articulate questions and refine them, rather than, I kind of almost assume that I don't take anything it says for granted. I don't trust it. I think in particular areas, I found ChatGPT to be, in some instances, I was asking it a lot of very difficult questions about ancient history. And it got almost all of them wrong, weirdly. Like, made quite stupid mistakes. But it was still, it's useful, I think, sometimes to ask it if it can identify any errors in your reasoning, right? And also, like, say if you read a book, and we are much more prone to accept opinions based on authority, I think, than ChatGPT or other AI bots necessarily are. So there may be a famous author, whose reasoning perhaps is kind of vacuous, like like the Emperor's New Clothes type thing. And it's like a fad and everybody's into this thing, let's say. But you punch it into AI and it'll tell you, there's all sorts of flaws and, like there's errors, things that are left out of this argument, like the evidence contradicts this. Like, it's more likely to be able to just impartially lay out flaws and idiosyncratic views that are established on the basis of appeal to authority these days. But the other thing that I think, there's a couple of things that I think it's quite useful for. I use it sometimes in therapy. I'll give you a very specific example. Around about the mid-1990s, mindfulness became much more popular as a form of self-help and eclipsed something that had been around since the 70s-ish, which was assertiveness training. And you can combine these, but in some ways they're kind of antagonistic. One's more what we would call problem-focused coping. We divide coping in the research literature. There's dozens and dozens of different coping strategies, but usually one of the simplest distinctions between problem-focused and emotion-focused coping. So when you're faced with a stressful situation, either you try and change or eliminate the source of the stress, or you try to tolerate the stress and cope with the emotions better. And to some extent, that's going to turn on how much time you have, how much control you have over the source, right? But fundamentally, one of the main decisions you need to make if you're going to exhibit coping flexibility is you've got to be able to distinguish between addressing the problem at a practical level or emotional. Mindfulness generally is more of an emotion-focused coping strategy, and assertiveness is more of a problem focus strategies, like I'm actually going to say something to try and affect the other person's behavior or the relationship, right? Now, one of the reasons that I think assertiveness declined in popularity is that sometimes we have really good formulas for, guidelines that help people to articulate themselves in a more assertive way. There's a thing called the 4-step assertiveness strategy, which is useful. Again, not as like a rigid rope, but as a kind of rough template, right? So you can frame stuff in terms of this 4-step strategy and think, how does that sound? Like, does it sound better than what I normally say to other people? But it takes time to do it. So typically the 4 steps are, you kind of acknowledge common ground that you both agree on. Then you validate their perspective, you acknowledge what they're going to say. That kind of takes the wind out of their sails. Because otherwise, if you don't acknowledge the other person's position, all they're going to do as soon as you finish talking is then go, yeah, but I disagree and I feel this and that. But if you go, I know you disagree and I know you feel this, then that you've taken the words out their mouth. And so that they're kind of left a little bit, nonplussed at the end of what you're saying, usually. And then you kind of clearly assert how you feel, like, and what you think your rights are in the situation, what you want to happen. And then you propose a conclusion. Like, for example, what's lacking in many cases is that people express disagreement, maybe argue with other people, but then never propose a solution. And then, often if you can get people to the point where they say what they actually think should happen, you often have this weird experience where everybody just looks at each other and they go, fine. I don't have a problem with that. Like, geez, is that all? Like, you just wanted to finish work early and go ahead. Yeah. Knock yourself out, buddy. Like, what was all the fuss about? Like, so it's weird, like, how often just kind of articulating a proposed solution, maybe there's a compromise solution, can kind of resolve things. But if you check these 4 boxes, then in many cases that could be an effective strategy. But it takes people time to figure out how they would put things in those words. But if you can just get people to do a brain dump of what they were going to say, and then take a description of the 4-step strategy, like copy and pasted from a website, and dump them both in ChatGPT. And actually, what someone was going to say, people are expressing themselves by email or text message now anyway. So you can literally say, okay, like maybe you had a disagreement with an employee last week, and you sent them an email and everyone got really upset about it at work. It just didn't work out. Show me the email that you sent. Let's put it in ChatGPT, put in the 4-step assertiveness strategy, and just ask ChatGPT to paraphrase what you actually said, but putting it into this formula. And it does that pretty well. Yeah. And it does it within like 1 or 2 seconds or whatever, right? So normally people kind of scratch their head for it and they go, oh, I don't know about this, And again, you might be making them too passive by doing that, but there's pros and cons to everything. So I think what it can do is give some really good examples, right? And then ideally what you'd want to do is to say, okay, let's take away your training wheels and like get you to start doing this on your own without using AI. But like, this is how easy it would be to take what you said and just translate it into this more carefully worded format, right? And then like, how do you think that would have come across? Like, and usually what I find is most of the time people look at it immediately and go, yeah, obviously that sounds completely, it makes the same point, but in a much more tactful way. Yeah. And it's much more solution focused, right? So it's really good at providing an example of how you would paraphrase, of course, because it's a language model. So it's really good at paraphrasing stuff. But being able to paraphrase something in a particular format is actually one of the main stumbling blocks that a lot of people have had in previous decades when learning assertiveness, because to a large extent it's about learning a communication skill, right? So I believe that it has some potential there as a way of giving examples, like training people. But again, like we've already been saying, there's a problem with being overly passive. So in order to really develop that skill, you're going to have to fade that out, and start saying, okay, I get the idea now. I've seen a few examples of how things I actually said could have been worded differently. Now, next time, let's anticipate a meeting I've got tomorrow, and this is what I want to say. How could I potentially phrase that differently? So there are many ways that I think AI has potential, but things like that already seem to me to be really useful.
Yeah.
Clearly so.
100%. Yeah. I've been playing around with that in that context. With the Socrates example I gave, I also meant that instead of playing the role of Socrates, you could ask ChatGPT to play the role of Socrates and question you. So you are the one coming up with definitions. So it's much more active than just kind of, talking endlessly.
I can see a role for that. I mean, actually, even having said that Socrates kind of expresses these concerns about books, I suppose an interesting, I don't know the answer to this for sure, but I think, the dialogue, the philosophical dialogue is a genre that is pretty almost extinct now, right? Plato wrote these dialogues. Nobody really, very few, I'm sure there are some people, very few people write philosophical dialogues anymore. I mean, it's virtually unheard of, right? And one reason for that is it does take a little bit of patience to read them, right? But actually, maybe this is a good point to touch on. Like, one possible advantage of reading philosophical dialogues is I believe it can help people to observe the process of reasoning and observe the consequences of holding certain opinions or beliefs from a more detached perspective. Because in a dialogue, it's often, in a good dialogue, it seems more like you can imagine a real person actually believing something. And so what I think often happens is, rather than just kind of reading it in an abstract way in a lecture or something, or a typical prose textbook, if someone is expressing a belief in a dialogue, I think we're more able to imagine what would be the consequences, though, of that belief, like emotionally, on their relationship. How would it kind of come across? So in a more holistic way or more rounded way, I think it enables us to take a sort of more objective psychological perspective on evaluating certain beliefs and attitudes. And that can be therapeutic. There's a technique that I think is quite helpful, that I know that people find useful to learn about, called Iliism. It comes from Ili, which is a Latin third-person pronoun. And Iliism is when you speak about yourself in the third person. So rather than saying, Donald had a problem earlier on posting a parcel and it made him kind of frustrated, but he figured out a solution. But rather than saying I had a problem earlier on and I got frustrated, I would say Donald had a problem and he got frustrated, right? As if you were talking about another person having it. There's research that shows, from the University of Waterloo, they have a Centre for Researching Wise Reasoning. There's research that shows that when people phrase things in the third person like that they exhibit more intellectual humility, more cognitive flexibility, more ability to arrive at compromise solutions or combine possible solutions. So they show better thinking skills and reasoning in the third person about a problem than they would reasoning about it in the first person. This idea definitely exists in ancient philosophy. Like Galen, Marcus Aurelius' physician, is pretty explicit about discussing this problem. Like, we have biases and blind spots that make us quite difficult at being our own therapist, unfortunately. And that's, Socrates doesn't use Iliism, but he does often do something that's kind of like it, which is that he often engages in hypothetical dialogues or imaginary dialogues in which he imagines someone talking to him in the second person. So in a dialogue called the Critias, he imagines the laws of Athens as a kind of hypothetical abstract concept critiquing his behavior and they say, Socrates, you're mistaken and you're contradicting yourself on this matter, blah, blah, blah. Like, so that's just a way of forcing himself to refer to himself in the second person and by name. So achieving the same kind of external point of view or objectivity that we would have if we used Eliasm. I think it's basically the same thing or a very similar kind of technique, right? So but the whole, how you become better at that. If you engage in dialogues with real people, then you're going to develop the same skills that you would when you engage in an imaginary dialogue with yourself, right? And, we find there's several references to this in the ancient literature that Socrates would practice engaging in internal dialogue with himself as a form of self-improvement. So I think Eliasm is a strategy that we kind of use a little bit in cognitive behavioural therapy. Although there's some evidence that when people do this, it can also reduce their anxiety, for example. Yeah. Like when people refer to their anxious thoughts in the third person, they get in the habit of doing that. It can dilute the intensity of the feeling. So again, modern research on decision-making, problem-solving, and on psychotherapy kind of reinforces ideas, techniques that we find being used in ancient philosophy, as if just through intuition alone, these guys were kind of onto something that was 2,500 years ahead of its time.
So we've been going 2 hours and 11 minutes, which is amazing. I'm just loving this. I have 2 questions left for you.
All right, cool.
The first, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time since doing your course. It's Socrates' wife, Xanthippe. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. So when she's described, she's framed as almost just like this very hot-tempered prude, is that what you'd call it? And kind of Socrates
Prudish,
yeah. And Socrates is kind of a bit distant from her and kind of more focused on philosophy. But when I was thinking about the relationship, I was thinking that it sounds almost like a abusive relationship. It sounds almost like there's, like the way she's acting, it sounds like she is verbally and physically abusing Socrates, and he may have some kind of personality disorder, right? She's not quite stable, just from the description.
It's possible.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I can see that, right? And but I think there's alternative ways of interpreting it, right? So it's possible, right? With something like that, I guess, writing biography and telling a story, ancient history, I think there's multiple possible interpretations. There's one that's maybe more sort of favorable to her or to Socrates, and then there's ones that, are maybe a little bit more cynical or maybe like more concerned about like what we're reading. And then we also need to cut some slack or make some allowances for cultural differences, right? So in the ancient Mediterranean world, I think it's fair to say that people expressed emotion differently. And, people typically expressed emotion in a much more physical form. Mm. So some of the behavior in general seems a little bit shocking to us. So we will often hear even about adult Mediterranean men tearing their hair out, beating their chests, beating their face with their fists, in grief over something or rage. So, we don't in modern day America, Britain or Canada kind of express our emotions in that way, but people in other cultures do, right? So there's more of kind of physical expressiveness. So it's not, with that in mind, we're told things like she tore the shirt off his back, she threw a bucket of water over him, she trampled a cake that he'd been given as a gift, which sounds kind of extreme from our point of view. I don't think it would actually have seemed as extreme in classical Athenian culture. I could be wrong about that, but the impression I get is that kind of really expressive physical emotional behavior was not as unusual in those times as it would be today. So can we view it as a personality disorder? or some kind of mental health problem. It's very difficult to make a judgment about that, in my view, when we're dealing with cultural differences in emotion. Like, if that's within the normal bounds of emotional expression, it might seem really weird to us or kind of extreme to us. I mean, I suppose the question would be, if someone's emotional reactions are much more extreme than other members of their culture, then we're more likely to think in terms of a mental health diagnosis. But what if that's within the normal bounds of how people in general express their emotion in that culture? Then I think it's harder to label it as a mental health problem. It's tricky. It's a notoriously difficult question. Cross-cultural psychopathology, basically, and especially when we're talking about different eras in history. But so I keep an open mind about it. I can kind of see it either way. Maybe Socrates' wife was crazy. Like, maybe she was like, maybe she had mental health problems, or maybe she was a really horrible person, or maybe I can imagine also it just coming across differently in that culture. It might be that people looking at her just thought this is how a lot of people react, like in classical Athens in these situations. But it would seem weird to us. Now, in terms of his relationship with us, we don't have a lot of evidence, but by the way, she's believed to have been about 30 years younger than him. So she sounds like she was quite a lot younger, which actually wouldn't have been that unusual in ancient Greece and also like in Roman society as well. Yeah. Today we might think that's quite a big age gap, but no, it wouldn't seem so out of place then. Especially also, by the way, after many adult men had been killed in the Peloponnesian War, so there wouldn't be as many. There would be a lot of unmarried women and not as many men around. And there's also a story that Socrates had 2 wives. And again, some scholars believe that's plausible, and it could be a consequence of the Peloponnesian War, like that maybe it became the norm for men to take a second wife, so that somebody would have to in their culture take responsibility, perhaps for women that had been widowed or that husbands weren't available for, or so there's some cultural differences and complexities there. Socrates, in one of Xenophon's dialogues, Socrates says that he emphasizes that Xanthippe is a good wife and a good mother, and that he really values her, despite the fact that she has this hot temper. So it's hard because we don't know her, right? But at least in that little snippet, he comes across as seeming quite confident that she's somebody that he values as a wife and a mother to his children. Maybe even, I hesitate. I was about to say that it's somebody that he loves, but actually in classical Athens in that time, it's not that common for men to express love towards their wives. Most of the love poetry that we have, brace yourselves, gentle readers, like from classical Athens, most but not all of the love poetry is written between men, rather than written by men to women. And so it was bisexuality of a sort was fairly normal. Like, sexual mores were very different from our society. So Socrates quite possibly had a male lover of sorts, like, in addition, and maybe 2 wives. Like, so there's a bit of a different family setup. So much for the nuclear family and all that, right? Yeah. Like, it wasn't necessarily as simple as that in ancient Athens. But yeah, she can come across as a bad mother. But actually, in that dialogue with Lamprocles, there Socrates really seems to be making the case that despite her bad temper, she's actually a fundamentally good and caring person. So he's kind of making out that we shouldn't be too quick to judge somebody by just the superficial behavior. So somebody might have quite a sharp tongue, but still you can imagine somebody who could be, could raise a voice, and be quite sharp. But when you view the behavior in general, they still come across as a very loving and caring person, right?
Yeah.
People are complex. Like, I think that's the picture I feel. So we have such little information to go on. It's a little bit tricky, but that's one way of interpreting what he says about her.
It was interesting because doesn't he kind of make the claim that he uses her to almost practice his tolerance, and he chose a wife that was particularly difficult to kind of rein in?
He compares it to training horses. But the funny thing, I don't think it mentions this in the dialogue, but that's what her name means. Xanthippe means a yellow horse. And he says, someone who's learning to train horses, again, a bit like this thing about choosing a sparring partner, which is a strange analogy for a wife, but like he said someone who's learning to train horses would pick like not easily domesticated horses, but ones that are, that are harder so that they can train and improve their skills. Yeah. Right? If you imagine there's different, you could grade horses on how difficult they are to train, and if you want to really improve your skills as a horse trainer, then you start working with progressively more difficult ones until you're the go-to guy for dealing with even the most difficult. And he says Xanthippe is challenging, but I guess it's like this thing as well of being able to choose, is this something that you're confident that you can deal with, or is it something that you would just feel overwhelmed by? And Socrates seems Socrates probably is an exceptionally resilient individual. So he seems completely unfazed. And actually, funnily enough, you could say, if we say this is abuse, like tearing his shirt and throwing water over him, she doesn't actually do him any physical harm, right? Mm-hmm. So, sometimes he seems to joke about that. Like he said, there's a joke where she threw water over him, and he said, "I told you that Xanthippe's thunder would be followed by rain," right? So he's like, it's nothing to him. Like, it's not. This is a guy that survived the plague and 3 major battles in the Peloponnesian War. Also, we should remember. Like, he's seen people being slaughtered around him. His wife throwing a bucket of water over his head is like super trivial.
Yeah.
Like in Socrates' terms.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by that relationship because there's so many questions and it's open to interpretation. So the last question is kind of like a personal question in terms of how you approach reading. Because if you take like the works of Plato, I'm wondering what's going on in your mind when you're reading a book, maybe for the first time. Are you trying to remember key details? Are you challenging the author? Because I remember you said that when you first read Plato, not the Republic, but after that, you would close your eyes and think about the ideas. So do you have any advice on how we can approach reading these texts?
There are many things over the years that people have taught me to do and I've learned to do in terms of reading, and I've changed my habits quite a lot over time. But for instance, if I'm reading a book, I read less and less as I get older, and often I'm just going back and reading the same books. Actually, I think if you're an author, particularly if you write books that involve a lot of research, the paradox is people send me free books all the time. Like I get inundated with books, right? But I have very little time to read modern books because usually I'm kind of up to my neck in reading and rereading classical texts, and to write a book you usually have to do a lot of research and spend all day reading books for your research. So then you don't have that much time to kind of read new books for pleasure. So I've become much more selective in my reading. I used to be, when I was a young guy, I insisted on reading books cover to cover. And I realize now that that's unnecessary, especially when you're kind of inundated. And so often the first thing I'll read in a book is the index, which is kind of like odd. But I over time, I read the table of contents and I read the index. And I'll look at the index and think, are there first of all, is stuff that I'm hoping to get out of this book. Maybe it's never mentioned anywhere in the index. Like, so hang on a minute, am I wasting my time reading this book? Perhaps it doesn't even mention the thing that I was assuming that it was going to mention. Or maybe it does mention it, but it's all in one chapter. I think I should probably just read that chapter first and cut to the chase. Like, because, why wade through all of the other stuff is the bit that I was actually interested in is all in chapter 5. So I think, okay, go straight to chapter. If I want, I could go back and read the rest of it. I don't read, and also I don't necessarily read stuff in sequence anymore. I used to, again, be a stickler for that in the past. And now I'll often go straight to the bit that I think is most relevant. And then I might go back and read the rest of the book if I think it would be useful to do that. I make a lot of notes. Often, it depends. Also, I'll read in maybe 2 different ways. Like, I'll speed read some books. So I'll run my finger along the line, and I train myself to go through something really quickly. But to me, that's skim reading, and I'm not going to digest it as much. But if the goal is that I just have to kind of get through something for some reason, like I'll use a pen, or I'll run my finger along the line by line so that my gaze doesn't wander and I get through it more quickly. Or, with some other books, I'll go through them really slowly and I'll make a lot of notes as I'm going if I think I really want to kind of squeeze, everything that I can out of it.
Your notes like questions to the author, or are they just things you want to like think about later on, or?
I think it is to summarize information in my notes. And actually, I'm trying to usually to summarize stuff so that it's easier for me to remember it afterwards.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes there'll be questions. I'm a big believer in writing down questions. Like in meetings where people maybe have action points and things, like I'll often like to have a list that I'll label unanswered questions. And then I'll say, okay, what are all the and sometimes when I'm having a meeting with other people, I might say, what are all of the unanswered questions that everyone has, and how would we answer them? How do we answer these unanswered questions? Like, is I think a useful way of putting it. Because usually it's pretty simple. We go, I don't know, the unanswered question is, how long would it take to do X, Y, and Z? And you think, well, why don't we just ask somebody? We could look at it, like just Google it or whatever. Like, the information that's missing for people, often you find this in therapy as well. When you're working with clients, you often ask them, what prevents you from being able to do such and such? And clients will say, well, I don't know, who I'd contact. And you're like, how would you find that out? And well, I guess I could ask around or whatever. And so the solution to this is pretty simple. Like, often people avoid taking steps, or they make things seem more complicated than they are. People stall because they have information missing that would be easy for them to obtain, especially now with AI. Actually, AI, another thing it does is potentially make it much easier to find obscure information, and answer the sort of questions that people typically get stuck with. But again, the skill with AI, I think, is in figuring out what questions to ask it. So making these lists of unanswered questions that are, or creating obstacles for you, I think, or, with a book, what is it that you still don't understand? What is it that doesn't make sense about it? I think useful questions to ask. Yeah, like those are, when I'm reading a book, those are some of the things that I would typically do. Sometimes I try and visualize having a conversation with the author. Like when I was writing about Socrates, every single time I was working on the book in the library, I'd sit down and I'd set a timer for 10 minutes and I'd visualize that I was talking to Socrates, and I'd just be like, Socrates, I don't understand this thing that you said. I'd even get quite kind of annoyed about a confrontation. I'll be like, there's a go. And often I wouldn't get an answer, but at least I spent some time kind of like, really focusing on something that I was stuck with, articulating my questions more clearly by imagining that I'm addressing them to sort of, what were you, why did you say this? Why is it, don't you think that these two things that you said are kind of contradictory? Like, what did you really mean when you said such and such? Sometimes I got answers by doing that. Often I think it's a slow burn process. I was saying this to someone earlier, like one of the weird things was I would often, at the beginning when I was working on that book, I was more concerned about kind of getting historical accuracy. It's pretty, I probably downplay this too much. Like it's pretty, that book, the account that I give of Socrates' life, to many people, if they bother to go and kind of check the ancient sources, they'll go, this is pretty accurate. Like in many cases. But there are some places where we'd have to make assumptions or fill in gaps and things like that. And so I'd imagine talking to Socrates and saying, when did this event happen? We don't know the date. Like, like, give me a clue here. Like, when did this happen? And why did this happen? And how did you know this guy? And da-da-da-da-da. And for some reason, every single time I'd kind of get the same sort of response, which is my imaginary Socrates seemed surprisingly indifferent to questions of historical accuracy. He, more than me, like he'd over and over again, he'd be like, what difference does it make? Like, he'd say, what matters are the philosophical ideas, right? What matters are the questions. What matters is like helping people to figure out the point of the dialogue. Like, it doesn't matter whether one of my main questions would be things like, when you met Protagoras and you had this famous dialogue with him, did that happen before or after the oracle at Delphi said there was no man wiser than Socrates, for instance, right? And I'd be like, I could kind of see reasons to date these events at different times and stuff. And I'd be like, so like, just tell me, like, when exactly did this event happen? And was it before or after this event? And he'd be like, what difference does it make? Like, does it really matter? Like, he says, surely he would always be like, he was always saying to me, the main thing is, are your readers going to benefit from this? Right? Like, are people going to read this and be inspired? Are they going to get the point? Are they going to ask themselves these questions? Right? And does answering these historical questions really make any difference in that regard? Right? And that was when I kind of decided to be more emphatic in the introduction to the book and say, this is a self-consciously semi-fictional approach to writing the biography of Socrates, right? And there'll be bits of it that people disagree with or that they think could potentially be chronologically different or interpreted differently. But it's grounded very carefully. That's why there are extensive footnotes in it referencing a wide range of ancient sources. So sometimes I think I kind of overplay that hand in saying that it's like semi-fictional. It's like a screenplay. It's a dramatized version. But I felt that I had to do this because I think it was an obstacle. Like, I thought there's an amazing story here. And I thought, how come people don't know this story already? Why hasn't this already been done? Yeah. And I think the answer is because there are too many questions about the historical events. And that frightens people or creates an obstacle that prevents them from attempting to tell the story of Socrates. And I thought, that's a shame, because if I went back in time and said to my 17-year-old self, there's this amazing story about the life of Socrates, it's really inspiring, and it's a great way to really make people feel much more interested and engaged with the philosophy, but I can't tell you that story because some of the dates don't line up. And there's a couple of bits of details that we're not really sure about, so we'd have to kind of make assumptions. I think my 17-year-old self would say, like Socrates, who cares? Like, just say it's semi-fictional and just get on with it and tell us the actual story, and then maybe later we'll figure out, okay, yeah, you got these two dates the wrong way around, perhaps. Maybe there's some evidence that you overlooked or whatever, but it doesn't really matter, and sometimes even if the events were changed, the fact that you've attempted to tell the whole story kind of reveals more about the character anyway. Like we get more by putting everything together into a coherent whole. I think we feel that we get to know Socrates better even if we've made mistakes about. I mean, some of the sources are considered more reliable than others. So some of the details of his life, one is, for example, I think it's only in the anecdotal tradition, like the centuries later, that we're told that his father was a stonemason, right? So some people think, well, that's questionable because it's not explicitly stated in Plato or Xenophon. Like the sources that come later tell us. Although to complicate things further, those later sources, like Diogenes Laertius, for example, maybe writing many centuries later, they had access to books that we don't, that had been written much earlier, right? So they're not just kind of like making all this stuff up, many centuries later. Sometimes what they're doing is reporting stuff that they've read in books that were written closer to the original period, potentially, right? So the reasons why they could potentially be right about these details. So again, we could think, okay, let's pretend that we have no idea what he originally did for a living. He must have had some kind of trade, because his family probably, had some kind of trade that he would have inherited and trained in as a young man. Like, why not accept that it's being a sculptor or a stonemason, because that's what we're told later. Yeah. Like, we can't be absolutely sure of that, but it makes a lot of sense. And it definitely contributes in an interesting way to the story of his life. But we could be wrong about it, right? But it allows us to tell a more rounded story about him. He did something when he was a young guy, and then he abandoned doing it, right? And so at the very least, it gives us the idea, where it allows us to communicate the idea of somebody that abandoned the profession that he would have inherited from his father, which is almost certainly must be the case. But it could be that it was some other trade that he did. So there's, I guess, when I'm approaching writing it, these imaginative exercises I think were very useful for me. And so when I'm reading the Platonic dialogues or Xenophon as well, I'll sometimes imagine that I'm engaging in a conversation with the characters.
Would you, like, this to me, I love this, the book is way cooler now, to imagine Socrates almost guiding, the spirit of Socrates guiding you in some of the creative decisions. Would you say this might be the only, because you've read a lot of Socrates biographies and books, would you say this might be the only one written that Socrates, as we know him, would actually be like, oh, I'm happy with this, as opposed to, oh, it's just like a objective account? It sounds like it could be something that, like, he could be like, oh, nice work, I'm happy that this is taking some of the spirit.
I wonder, I mean, again, yeah, like I guess that's what I try to do by dramatizing it rather than doing what would be technically referred to as an academic history, where we weigh up the evidence and stuff. I wrote it in a more narrative style, so it's more like a screenplay, a movie, or something like that. I do believe that Socrates would probably prefer that to an academic history, as would many ancient authors, because they think the point is you're telling a story that's meant to inspire people, right? And even if there's, like, alternative versions of it, or there might be some question over the accuracy of certain details, that's not the main thing. The main thing is, do the people come away from it feeling like they get what Socrates was about, and they can see how the Socratic method would really benefit people, some of the challenges and obstacles that he may have faced and overcome, and so on. Like, does it have an edifying effect? Does it have a motivational, inspiring effect? That's the main thing. Like in Plutarch's Lives, for example, Plutarch says, he is one of the earliest biographers, he's writing these accounts, which are probably of questionable accuracy in many cases, because they're meant to teach people about virtue and strength of character. Like they have an edifying effect, not just they're not just meant to be like historical records. So yeah, I think Socrates would probably think, look, the like the main benefit that people could derive from this is that they would be inspired to ask these questions. And I write at the beginning of the book, when you're reading the dialogues, I think it helps. You're talking about how to read books and stuff. I should say that I mention in the introduction that if you imagine that you're one of the characters in the dialogues, or both the characters in the dialogues, and really try and put yourself in their shoes, I think you'll gain a lot more from the book, because then you experience what it's like to face certain questions and to be caught in certain contradictions. Like it's almost an assault course for your mind. You're kind of going through the paces of, wrestling with certain fundamental ideas and questions yourself. I think there's more to be gained from it that way. And I think, like Socrates would say, by putting yourself in the shoes of the characters in the dialogue, experiencing it in your imagination, you're more likely to learn something than just by treating it as a kind of academic exercise.
Yeah, wow. Well, thank you so much for the time and incredible
pleasure.
Level of endurance. I know that you've been speaking previously to this discussion as well, so I love the passion that you bring. Like it's inspiring to me how meaningful these books and these thinkers are to you, and it makes me more like, all I want to do is read more about Socrates now, which I think it's
like, I often think as time goes on, get older, you've got like less time left.
Yeah.
And, when I think about that, I think, what out of all the books that I've read, what are the ones that I benefit from most? And again, like, it could be, I could say, it's modern books on psychological research, but they're not really the books that stick with me and inspire me. I do get a lot from them. Yeah. But Plato's Apology is one of the, I read it when I was like 16 or 17 or something, and it's got its hooks into me, like in a weird way, partly because the kind of poetry of it and the powerful nature of the images and the extreme nature, the philosophical points being made. There's something about that is significant, I think. And, we tend to water down things a little bit more. There's something like Greek tragedy is really tragic. Like, the ancient literature in some ways adopts more extreme positions, but which again might mean that we'd question it more, but it has leaves a more powerful impression on our mind and provokes more thought, provokes more questions, I think. Socrates says many deeply paradoxical things, like, injustice harms the perpetrator more than the victim. No man does evil knowingly. These are questions that people have wrestled with for thousands of years. Like, even if they don't agree with him, it's kind of a contagious idea that you want to kind of like chew over and keep returning to. Could he be right? Like, is there some sense in which he's right? What are his reasons for that? I think there's a lot of truth in the things that he says, but I maybe I'm qualifying that by saying, even if you don't accept these ideas, it still can have a very powerful effect on you, like to confront them and explore them. They're foreign ideas in a sense to the prevailing values of modern society. So they force us to kind of like step outside of our typical assumptions, like, and question things from a radically different perspective. So there's a power to this ancient literature, I think, that is almost timeless. And yeah, I don't have any hesitation recommending to people. I do feel passionate about it. It's been inspiring to me. The strange irony is, like as time goes on, I get older. I read a lot of books over the years. Like, these were some of the first books that I ever read. And like I find myself going back to the beginning, like the things that that originally excited me. And I thought, when I first read Plato, describing these dialogues with Socrates, I'd never read anything like this before. It kind of blew my mind. I thought, I think the first thing that hit me was I'd studied the Bible at school and Sunday school and stuff like that. I had no idea that somebody who lived like 400, 500 years before the New Testament was written could be posing questions like this, and reasoning in such a kind of rigorous and logical way. It seemed so radically different from and yet it resonated with the religion that I'd been taught as a child. But I had assumed that people prior to the time of the New Testament were more kind of primitive and superstitious in their thinking. Mm-hmm. Like, I never imagined that somebody like Plato or Aristotle would write and say the things that they did. That seemed extraordinary to me. And it seemed like they were much more contemporary in their thinking than I could have imagined them to be. So it really, it had a very profound effect on me. And also when I read some of the ancient texts, in many cases, they reminded me of Eastern philosophy, Buddhism and Taoism and stuff like that. And that came as a shock to me. I thought you had to go to India to learn about Buddhism and yoga and stuff. I thought I'm going to have to save up for a flight to India one day to study with the sannyasins and like go to Japan or somewhere and study Buddhism. And then I read Plato and I read the Stoics, and I thought a lot of the stuff is different, but there's similar kind of ideas, and this is part of my own culture. Nobody told me about this. How come no one told me? Like, there's all this stuff like in Western philosophy about impermanence and mindfulness and contemplating your own mortality and all of that. Like, why wasn't there? How come I know about Buddhism but I didn't know about this? Like, it's like it was hidden in my back. It's like it was hidden in my back garden or something like. Do you know what I mean? Like, so it's right there. No one even mentioned to me this stuff even existed.
So the book How to Think Like Socrates is out November 19th. And
yes,
I was looking on Audible as well. It says that
it's on Audible.
You're narrating the book as well.
Mm-hmm. I had to practice pronouncing 254 Greek names. Oh. And I have a friend who lives in Greece and I work very closely with. She's kind of a freelance editor that I work with, and she's a classicist. She's an expert on Greek and Latin. So my knowledge of ancient Greek is pretty limited, but luckily my friend Lauya is peerless in her ancient Greek and Latin, funnily enough. So, she coaches me. And I had to go in a recording studio and with an audio director and a sound engineer. And it's probably took 5 days. And then after that, I had to go in for another 2 days and record something else that I was doing, a different project. For Sam Harris's Waking Up app, I had to record a course of lectures on Stoicism, like that I had to write and set up and record one after another. So I had a whole stint of a lot of time in a recording studio recently. But yeah, I do the audio recording. And again, that's like pros and cons. Like, some people don't like the fact that I've got a funny accent, right? But other people do like it because it's kind of different. And so some people will go, oh, it's more interesting because it's like a regional accent, So I always think if everybody likes what you're doing, then what you've done is probably banal. Yeah. And so if some people can't stand what you're doing and other people really like it, then it's probably because you're doing something that's a little bit different, right? And so I take pride in that. I don't fear kind of criticism. I don't expect that everything that I do is going to be everybody's cup of tea. It's fine if some people can't stand my accent or they can't stand CBT, or they horrifies them that I've kind of dramatized bits of Socrates' life or whatever. Because other people will be fine with all that stuff, right? It's kind of like if you made, I think of it as like, often I think of writing as like making music. It's very similar in many ways. It'd be like if you made an album, if you imagine making an album that everybody thinks is okay, like, it would be, if you make a heavy metal album that's like a classic, there's going to be a lot of people that just can't stand heavy metal. Like, there's no way that everybody's going to like it. Or like an amazing jazz album. A lot of people hate jazz, right? So I tend to find that the people that don't like these books are mainly just they don't like the concept of combining history and philosophy and psychotherapy in this way. But if they're cool with the interdisciplinary approach, then generally I think that they like it. So I'm actually, basically I'm just happy as long as I can see that some people really like it, because I always kind of think it's not meant to be for everybody. But as long as there are some people that are like my 17-year-old self and like I am today, this is definitely the book, that I would have wanted to read. I would have thought this book was awesome when I was 17. I would say that categorically. If I could go back in time, my 17-year-old self would be like, wow, this is exactly what I was looking for. Right. So I kind of hope there are other people out there that are like that and go, yeah, this is awesome. I find it really engaging. Like there's all this kind of action and history and cool things that I didn't know about before. That's how, that kind of thing really turned me on to philosophy, is learning more about the history and learning more about the characters. When I was at university studying philosophy, I took to it really well, surprisingly well. But partly, again, you asked me about how to read books and stuff. I would, wherever possible, read biographies of the authors. I read biographies of Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell, a bunch of other more obscure philosophers, because I thought if I can picture the author, then this stuff that seems pretty abstract and dry at times kind of becomes more three-dimensional for me. Because I think, oh yeah, I know the guy that wrote this. Like, I can imagine him saying it. I've seen pictures of him and stuff. Like, it comes more alive for me than it would be normally. And so it made it easier for me to engage with it and easier for me to remember what he said and stuff. So I guess that was one of my techniques for studying a subject, is to literally go and read biographies and gather what information I could about the author to facilitate the process.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I like as well, like when the author narrates the book, I just know that they know the content. They're not just performing it, and there's something extra meaningful about that for me.
I write. There's another thing about writing books I should mention. I can't remember if I said this to you earlier, but when I write a book, the way that I approach it is what I call audio first. So I don't imagine that I'm writing a print book. I imagine that I'm writing an audio book. And then, because you could write a really good print book that sounds kind of clunky when you try and narrate it. But if you write a good audio book, it's also definitely going to read well as a print book anyway. Right. So I figured that out early on. And I thought, in that case, I should assume that I'm writing audiobooks first and foremost, rather than assuming that I'm writing print. Why would I think I'm writing a print book that just happens and then it may or may not work as an audiobook? It would make more sense to write it as an audiobook because I know that that's going to work as a print. Right. So I definitely write it as an audiobook, and that means that I'll read stuff aloud a lot more and get people to read the contents to me. And that, to me, that's another kind of like key part of the writing process. Like it has to sound okay as well as looking okay on the page. And sometimes there'll be things that you write that just sound weird when you read them, or sound really kind of clunky.
Yeah.
When you go to read it aloud.
I don't think there is an audiobook for Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. I haven't been able to find
No. That wouldn't, see, that was a book I wrote a long time ago, and it had to follow a format for a series the Teach Yourself series that I don't think really lends it. I think they do have audiobooks, but to me, that format doesn't seem to lend itself that well to being recorded as an audiobook.
Yeah, because the different sections of the book, and yeah.
I think it would sound weird. Like, so now, I mean, I guess in part also when I'm writing books now, I write them in a more of a narrative style. Like, I write them almost a little bit like a play. You know, Plato lends himself to that in Xenophon because they're dialogues anyway. You know, I just kind of take them, and dialogue is like a play, but with a lot of talking and not as much scene setting and so on. So I just add some elements to it to make it a little bit more three-dimensional. Add a little bit more action, like a little more description of body language and facial expressions and stuff like that as well, to make it come alive a bit more. But yeah, like writing it is an audiobook, and in a way that kind of prompts. The other thing, I suppose, when you're writing something for audiobook is that people, I think when they're listening to audiobooks, don't have the same attention span. So, you know, I think it's useful to focus on raising questions for the listener rather than just kind of like stating too many facts.
Yeah.
But and telling a story where they can kind of get lost in the story maybe and get the gist of it, you know, like rather than just kind of giving them a lecture that they might kind of go in one ear, and if they're driving the car or they're running on a treadmill or something like that and listening to it, they may be just getting like snippets. But if it's you're describing a scene and telling a story, they're more likely to be immersed in it and getting the sense of what's happening.
Yeah. That's awesome. I've been using the Waking Up app since it launched as well, so I'm very excited to see is it a course or an interview?
It's a course. It comes out in January, I believe.
Awesome.
On Stoicism.
Yeah, can't wait for that. All right. Well, thank you once again for almost going 3 hours. I appreciate your time. And yeah.
Welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Donald.
Cheers.